What if everything you know about history is just a carefully edited script? A narrative polished smooth by centuries of deliberate forgetting. Tonight, as the world outside your window settles into darkness, I want to take you somewhere the maps no longer remember. To a place that once sprawled across the northern half of our planet, and then simply vanished, as though it had never existed at all. There are old atlases, the kind you find in dusty corners of European libraries, their pages brittle and yellowed by time, marked with names that make no sense to the modern eye. One name appears again and again, written in elegant script across territories so immense they dwarf any empire we celebrate today. Tartaria, an empire that stretched from the frozen Arctic shores down through Siberia, across Mongolia, touching the edges of China and Persia. An empire so vast it would take months to cross on horseback. And yet, if you open any modern history textbook, any contemporary atlas, you will find nothing. No mention of its kings, no record of its wars, no dates of its rise or fall. Just silence. A silence so complete that most people have never even heard the name. But silence is not the same as absence. It is simply the sound that remains after something has been deliberately erased. Imagine standing in a great archive at 3 in the morning, the temperature held at a precise 64 degrees Fahrenheit to preserve documents that governments have kept locked away for centuries. The air smells of old leather and faded ink. Before you, spread across a table of dark oak, lies a map from 1701. It measures nearly 6 feet across, and your fingers trace the northern regions until you find it. Written in flowing calligraphy. Imperium Tartarorum. The Empire of the Tartars. The boundaries suggest a civilization of staggering scope, controlling more land than Rome at its height. The map shows cities, trade routes, rivers. It shows a functioning, sophisticated empire. Then you pull out a map from 1850, just 150 years later, and the name is gone. Not conquered, not absorbed, simply erased. The land is still there, but Tartaria has been painted over, divided into new provinces with new stories, as though someone had taken an eraser to the world itself. The evidence whispers through old documents. Jesuit letters from the 17th century describe cities of white stone that gleamed against the endless steppe, towers so tall they seemed to touch the clouds, buildings that hummed with strange energy. Dutch trading records mention Tartarian merchants. British explorer journals describe encounters with Tartarian nobles. These are not fantasies, but official documents archived in government institutions. And yet the civilization they describe has been completely removed from our collective memory, as thoroughly as if it had been nothing more than a dream. But perhaps the most haunting evidence is not in documents at all. It is in the architecture. From St. Petersburg to Samarkand, from Kazan to Istanbul, buildings share an uncanny similarity. The same onion-shaped domes, the same spiraling towers, the same impossible arches, as though built according to a single blueprint that has since been forgotten. And here is where it becomes truly unsettling. You find the same style in places that should have no connection to Central Asia. In old photographs of San Francisco before the 1906 fire, the same ornate facades appear. In pre-fire Chicago, the same domes. Even in Melbourne and Sydney, structures that look transported from the Mongolian steppes. The official story says they were Victorian constructions, But in those 19th century photographs, the buildings already look ancient, weathered by centuries rather than decades. And then there are the windows. In city after city, across continents, you find windows that should be at ground level, buried 10, 15, sometimes 20 feet below street level. Grand entrances leading down into earth. The official explanation is urban reconstruction, but the pattern is too consistent to be coincidental. Some researchers call this the mud flood, a cataclysm that supposedly struck in the early 19th century, submerging entire cities under waves of earth. If such an event occurred, what else might it have buried? What knowledge, what technologies, what entire civilizations might lie beneath our feet, just a few meters down, waiting in the darkness? So tonight, as you settle into the quiet hours, as your breathing slows and your mind begins to drift, I invite you to follow me into this mystery. We will walk through the shadows of forgotten maps, through the ruins of impossible architecture, through the silence that history has tried so hard to maintain. We will ask uncomfortable questions. What if the Industrial Revolution was not an invention, but a recovery? What if modern technologies were rediscoveries of something far older? What if our world is not the first version of civilization, but a reconstruction built on the bones of something greater? If you stay with me until the end, you will see something history has tried very hard to hide. You will glimpse the shape of a world that once existed, a civilization that mastered technologies we are only beginning to understand, an empire that fell not to armies, but to something more complete, the erasure of memory itself. If you are listening right now, wherever you are in the world, leave a comment telling me where you are, what time it is in your corner of the earth. Tell me if the light outside your window is dawn or dusk, if you can see stars or city glow. I want to know if the darkness where you are feels anything like the darkness that once covered the ruins of Tartaria, waiting patiently through centuries of forgetting. Because you are not just a passive listener tonight. You are a witness. You are part of this investigation. So breathe slowly. Let your body settle. Let the familiar world fade just a little at the edges. And follow me, now, into the empire of forgetting, into the civilization that was too beautiful, too advanced, too true to be allowed to survive. Follow me into Tartaria. Chapter 1. The Vanishing Maps. The maps lie waiting in archives scattered across Europe, each one a thread in a mystery that grows stranger the deeper you follow it. In Amsterdam, in a climate-controlled vault beneath the Rijksmuseum, where the temperature never varies from 64 degrees Fahrenheit, you find yourself standing before a collection of 17th century atlases. The air is dry, carefully filtered, carrying the faint scent of aged vellum and oxidized iron from centuries-old ink. The archivist, a woman with silver hair and careful hands, pulls out a volume so large it requires both arms to carry. She lays it on a table of polished oak, its surface worn smooth by generations of scholars who came before you, and opens it with the reverence usually reserved for sacred texts. The pages unfold like wings, each one nearly 3 feet across, covered in intricate illustrations of coastlines, mountain ranges sketched with delicate precision, and territories marked in Latin, French, and Dutch. Your eyes adjust to the lamplight, a warm golden glow that makes the faded colors seem almost alive, and you lean closer, your breath shallow, conscious that you are looking at something most people will never see. There, spreading across the northern regions like a vast organism, you see it. Grand, Tartary. The letters are written in flowing calligraphy, each stroke deliberate and confident, suggesting not myth, but established fact. Your finger traces the boundary lines, following them east from the Caspian Sea, north toward the Arctic Circle, across Siberia, down through Mongolia, touching the edges of what we now call China. The territory is staggering in scope, easily 4,000 miles from east to west, 2,000 from north to south. Within its borders, the cartographer has marked cities with tiny illustrations of towers and walls, rivers labeled with names you have never heard, mountain ranges that seem to follow patterns too precise to be natural. Trade routes are drawn as dotted lines connecting distant settlements, suggesting a network of commerce and communication that spanned half a continent. This is not the work of someone filling blank spaces with imagination. This is the work of someone mapping a known world, a functioning civilization, an empire that existed as surely as France or Spain or England. You turn the pages carefully, each one crackling softly under your touch, moving forward through time. A map from 1630 shows Tartaria with slightly different boundaries, but the same essential shape. Another from 1670 adds more detail, more cities, more rivers, as though the cartographers were learning more about this empire with each passing decade. In the margins, there are notes in Dutch and Latin, references to Tartarian merchants, to trade goods, to diplomatic contacts. These are not fantasies. These are working documents used by traders, explorers, diplomats, people who needed accurate information to conduct business and survive journeys into unknown territories. And then something changes. You reach a map from 1720, and the name is still there, but smaller now, its borders less certain. By 1750, the territory labeled Tartaria has shrunk, divided into smaller regions with new names. Grand Tartary becomes Independent Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Russian Tartary, as though the empire were being carved up by surrounding powers. But there are no records of the wars that would have accomplished this, no chronicles of conquest, no treaties documenting the transfer of territory. The empire simply fragments on paper, quietly, without explanation. And then, sometime in the early 19th century, the name vanishes entirely. You pull out an atlas from 1850, published in London, and where Tartaria once spread across thousands of miles, you now find Siberia, Mongolia, Turkestan, a patchwork of provinces and territories that seem to have appeared fully formed, as though they had always been there. The great cities marked on earlier maps are gone or renamed. The trade routes have been redrawn. The rivers flow in the same places, but they have different names now. It is as though someone had taken the entire empire, broken it into pieces, and scattered those pieces across new maps with new stories, carefully erasing any memory of what came before. The change is so complete, so thorough, that within a generation or two, people would have no reason to remember that Tartaria had ever existed at all. They would look at the new maps, accept the new names, and never think to ask what had been there before. But you are asking now, standing in this vault beneath Amsterdam, staring at the evidence of something that defies the official narrative of history. If Tartaria was simply a cartographic error, a name mistakenly applied to unknown territories, why does it appear so consistently across centuries of maps made by different cartographers in different countries? Why do the boundaries remain relatively stable for nearly 200 years before suddenly dissolving? And why, if it never existed, are there so many other documents that reference it, as though it were as real as any other nation? You ask the archivist if there are other sources, other evidence beyond the maps. She nods slowly and leads you to another section of the archive, where leather-bound volumes of correspondence are stored in acid-free boxes. Here, in letters written by Jesuit missionaries who traveled east in the 17th century, you find descriptions that make your skin prickle with recognition. They write of entering Tartarian territory, of cities built from white stone that seemed to glow in the pale northern light, of towers that rose so high they disappeared into low-hanging clouds. One priest describes a building, possibly a temple or palace, where the walls were covered in geometric patterns that seemed to shimmer and shift depending on the angle of the sun, as though the stone itself were alive with some subtle energy. Another writes of meeting Tartarian nobles who dressed in silk robes embroidered with symbols he did not recognize, who spoke languages that sounded like music, who possessed knowledge of astronomy and mathematics that surprised and unsettled him. These are not the descriptions of primitives or nomads. These are accounts of a sophisticated, organized, technologically advanced civilization. And yet, in the official histories written later, in the textbooks used to educate generations of students, there is no mention of such a civilization. The standard narrative says that Siberia and Central Asia were sparsely populated by nomadic tribes until Russian expansion brought civilization to the region in the 18th and 19th centuries. The Jesuit letters, with their detailed observations and careful documentation, are dismissed as exaggerations or misunderstandings, filed away in archives where almost no one will ever read them. You close the volume carefully and stand for a moment in the quiet of the archive, feeling the weight of what you have just discovered. The absence of Tartaria from modern history is not an accident. It is not the result of poor record-keeping or lost documents. The records exist. The maps exist. The letters and journals and trading logs all exist, stored in institutions across Europe, available to anyone willing to look. The absence is deliberate, a carefully maintained gap in the story we tell ourselves about the past. But why? What could possibly motivate such a thorough erasure? You think back to the maps, to the way Tartaria's borders overlapped with territories that would later be claimed by Russia, China, and the European colonial powers. An empire that controlled such vast resources, such strategic territory, would have been a rival to any nation that sought to expand eastward. Perhaps the erasure was political, a way of justifying conquest by pretending there was nothing there to conquer, no civilization to displace, just empty land waiting to be claimed. Or perhaps it was something else, something deeper. Perhaps Tartaria represented a way of organizing society, a kind of knowledge or technology that was incompatible with the industrial age that was dawning. Perhaps its existence was inconvenient, not because of what it controlled, but because of what it knew. The thought lingers as you thank the archivist and step back out into the Amsterdam afternoon, where the light seems too bright after the dimness of the archive, where the modern city hums with traffic and voices and the constant low-frequency buzz of electricity. You carry with you the image of those maps, the confident calligraphy spelling out a name that no longer exists. And and you wonder how many other things have been quietly removed from our collective memory. How many other empires, technologies, or ways of understanding the world have been buried beneath the smooth surface of official history? Somewhere in the back of your mind, a question begins to form, soft at first, but growing louder with each step you take away from the archive. If an entire empire can vanish from human memory in less than 2 centuries, what else have we forgotten? What else are we forgetting right now, in our own time? As new maps are drawn and old stories are rewritten. The buildings around you, the streets beneath your feet, even the sky above seems suddenly less solid, less certain, as though everything you thought you knew about the world might be just another layer of story, waiting to be peeled back to reveal something older, stranger, and far more mysterious beneath. Those who built Tartaria, whoever they were, left traces that refuse to die completely. The maps are one kind of trace, but there are others, and as you will soon discover, some of those traces are still standing, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone with quiet eyes and a patient heart to recognize them for what they are. If you can feel those maps taking shape in your mind, the borders spreading across inner landscapes, the lost names whispering at the edge of memory, just write the word yes in the comments below, and I will know you are still walking this path with me, still willing to follow the thread deeper into the labyrinth, where truth and forgetting dance their eternal dance. Chapter 2: The Impossible Architecture. The photographs arrive in cardboard boxes, carefully wrapped in tissue paper that crinkles softly as you peel it away. They are old, some dating back to the 1860s. Images captured on glass plates and albumin prints, their surfaces yellowed and foxed with age, but still remarkably clear. You spread them across a wide table in a room where the afternoon light slants through tall windows, and as you arrange them in chronological order, a pattern begins to emerge that makes something tighten in your chest. A recognition that feels almost like remembering. Here is San Francisco in 1856, before the Great Fire, and the buildings that line its streets are unlike anything the official history suggests should be there. Massive structures with ornate facades, their walls covered in intricate carvings, their rooflines crowned with domes that bulge like onions, spiraling upward to sharp points, topped with what appear to be metallic crescents or stars. The architecture is unmistakably similar to what you might see in Samarkand or Kazan. Yet here it stands on the western edge of America, supposedly built by pioneers who arrived just a few years earlier with little more than picks and shovels. You pick up another photograph, this one from Chicago in 1871, taken weeks before the fire that would consume the city. The same style appears again, buildings 4 and 5 stories tall with the same curved domes, the same elaborate stonework, the same geometric precision. The people in the foreground, men in top hats and long coats, women in heavy dresses, seem almost comically small against these structures, like children standing before monuments built by giants. Their postures suggest uncertainty, as though they are visitors rather than builders, temporary inhabitants of spaces that predate them. You notice something else, too. Something that appears in photograph after photograph once you start looking for it. The buildings, supposedly constructed in the mid-19th century, already show signs of significant weathering. The stone is darkened in places, eroded at the corners, stained by what looks like decades or even centuries of exposure to wind and rain. Window frames sit at odd heights, some of them half buried in the street level, their lower panes covered by earth or paving stones, suggesting that the ground around them has risen, or that they have sunk, or perhaps that they were built when the surface of the earth was somewhere else entirely. You arrange photographs from other cities, Melbourne, Boston, St. Petersburg, Toronto, and the pattern repeats with unsettling consistency. The same architectural vocabulary appears across thousands of miles, continents apart, in places that should have developed independently, that should show the influence of different cultures, different materials, different climatic needs. And yet they share this common language of domes and arches, of spiraling towers and geometric facades, of proportions that seem to follow mathematical ratios rather than aesthetic whims. It is as though someone had drawn a single blueprint and distributed it across the entire world. Or as though all these cities were built by the same civilization, a civilization that understood something about structure and resonance and harmony that we have since forgotten. The official explanations call this style Beaux-Arts, or Victorian Eclectic, or Moorish Revival. Names that suggest it was a fashion, a brief trend that swept through architecture in the late 1800s, before being replaced by the stark functionalism of the modern age. But fashions do not usually produce buildings of this scale and sophistication in places that supposedly had no architects, no engineering schools, no established building traditions. You pull out a magnifying glass and examine the details more closely, leaning over a photograph of a massive structure in St. Petersburg, its facade covered in what appear to be acoustic panels, geometric shapes arranged in patterns that repeat with fractal-like precision. The windows are tall and narrow, positioned at intervals that suggest they might be tuned to specific frequencies, and the dome that crowns the building is not a simple hemisphere, but a complex structure made of multiple layers, each one slightly smaller than the last, creating what engineers today would recognize as a resonant cavity. This is not decorative architecture. This is functional architecture, designed with a purpose that goes beyond shelter or display. Someone built these structures to do something, to interact with sound or light or magnetic fields in ways that modern buildings, with their steel frames and glass curtain walls, do not even attempt. You think of Tesla, of his tower at Wardenclyffe that was meant to transmit electrical energy through the atmosphere, using the Earth itself as a conductor. And you wonder if he was trying to recreate something he had seen in these older buildings, some technology that had been lost or suppressed or simply forgotten in the rush toward coal and oil and combustion. The more you study the photographs, the more impossible the timeline becomes. Take the Chicago World's Fair of 1893, the so-called White City, where hundreds of massive neoclassical buildings appeared seemingly overnight, covering more than 600 acres, with structures that rivaled the great palaces of Europe. The official story says they were temporary, built from staff, a mixture of plaster and fiber, meant to last only for the duration of the fair before being demolished. But when you look at the photographs, when you see the thickness of the walls, the depth of the foundations, the complexity of the infrastructure that supplied water, electricity, and sewage to a temporary city housing hundreds of thousands of people, the story strains credulity. The buildings in those photographs look substantial, permanent, built to endure for generations. Their facades show the same weathering, the same signs of age that appear in other structures from this period. And then, within months of the fair's closing, they were destroyed, torn down so completely that almost nothing remained, as though someone wanted to eliminate any evidence of what they really were. You come across a photograph that stops you cold, an image of a street in San Francisco after the 1906 earthquake and fire. The wooden buildings are gone, consumed by flames, but scattered among the ruins are structures of stone and brick that remain standing, their walls blackened but intact. What is striking is the lack of debris. In a fire hot enough to melt iron and shatter stone, you would expect to see massive piles of rubble, collapsed walls, the remains of wooden beams and floors. But the streets in this photograph are eerily clean, as though something swept through and removed everything combustible, leaving only the stone skeletons behind. Some researchers have suggested that the fires that consumed cities in the late 19th century were not ordinary fires, that they burned too hot, spread too fast, and left patterns of destruction that do not match what we know about conventional combustion. They whisper about directed energy, about weapons or technologies that could generate intense heat in focused beams, about the possibility that these fires were not accidents, but deliberate acts of demolition, clearing away evidence of an older world to make room for the new. It sounds like conspiracy, like paranoia, until you look at the photographs and see that the official explanations do not quite fit the evidence, that there are details that refuse to be explained away. Consider the windows again, those half-buried openings that appear in city after city. The phenomenon is so widespread, it has its own name among researchers who study these things: the mud flood, a hypothetical catastrophe that supposedly struck in the early to mid-1800s, submerging ground floors and basements under layers of earth. The official explanation is that cities raised their street levels to improve drainage, to accommodate growing populations, to build infrastructure for water and sewage systems. But the sheer scale of such an undertaking, repeated independently in dozens of major cities across multiple continents in the span of a few decades, suggests something else, some common cause that affected the entire world. If you accept the possibility of such an event, then you must also accept that the world we know today is built on top of another world, that beneath our feet lie the buried levels of cities that were once fully functional, streets and buildings and infrastructure that were covered over and forgotten. And if that is true, then what we call history is not a continuous narrative, but a series of resets, moments when the surface of the world changed dramatically, and the survivors had to begin again, rebuilding on top of what came before, often without fully understanding what they were building upon. The architectural evidence suggests that whoever built these structures understood principles of acoustics, resonance, and energy that we are only now beginning to rediscover. Modern acoustic engineers have studied some of the great domed cathedrals of Europe and found that they act as resonant chambers, amplifying certain frequencies while dampening others, creating spaces where sound behaves in unusual ways. In some cathedrals, a whisper at one end can be heard clearly at the other, hundreds of feet away, while normal speech in the center of the space seems to disappear, absorbed by the geometry of the walls and ceiling. In others, specific musical notes will cause the entire structure to vibrate, as though the building itself were a giant tuning fork, responding to the right frequency. These effects were once attributed to accident or divine inspiration, but modern analysis reveals that they are the result of precise mathematical relationships, ratios of dimensions and angles that could only have been calculated deliberately. The builders of these spaces understood something about the relationship between geometry and sound, between structure and vibration, that allowed them to create architecture that was not just shelter, but instrument, not just building, but technology. And if Tartaria did exist, if it was the civilization that spread this architectural knowledge across the world, then its fall was not merely political or military. It was a silencing, the destruction of a way of building and thinking that was too sophisticated, too generous, too dangerous to be allowed to survive. A civilization that could generate and distribute energy through resonance, through the natural frequencies of the earth itself, would have no need for coal, for oil, for any of the extractive industries that would come to define the industrial age. Such a civilization would be an existential threat to anyone who sought to control resources, to monopolize power, to build an economy based on scarcity rather than abundance. Perhaps that is why the evidence of Tartaria's existence had to be erased so thoroughly, why the buildings had to be destroyed or renamed, why the maps had to be redrawn and the archives sealed. Not because the civilization was primitive or insignificant, but because it represented an alternative, a different path that humanity might have taken, one that led away from extraction and consumption and toward harmony and balance. You gather the photographs carefully, sliding them back into their protective sleeves, and sit for a moment in the fading afternoon light. The buildings in those images are gone now, most of them, destroyed by fire or earthquake or deliberate demolition, replaced by structures that bear no resemblance to what came before. But here and there, scattered across the world, a few survivors remain, their domes rising above modern skylines, their facades still bearing the traces of that older architectural language. They stand like messages from a forgotten world, like questions carved in stone, asking anyone who has the patience to look, who built us? And why have we been allowed to remain when so much else was erased? The answer, you are beginning to suspect, lies not in what these buildings are, but in what they were meant to do. Not in their appearance, but in their function. Not in the beauty of their facades, but in the frequency of their song. And somewhere in the quiet spaces between these thoughts, you can almost hear it. A faint harmonic tone, like the memory of music that once filled the world before someone decided that silence was safer, that forgetting was necessary, that the old song had to die, so that a new one, harsher and more discordant, could take its place. Chapter 3. The Mudfloods and Reset. There is something deeply unsettling about walking through the basement of an old building in Boston or Paris or St. Petersburg and discovering that what you thought was a basement was once the ground floor. That the windows, now half buried in earth, once opened onto streets that no longer exist at the same elevation. The air down here is cool, perhaps 58 degrees Fahrenheit, and it carries the smell of damp stone and ancient mortar, of earth that has been undisturbed for more than a century. You descend the stairs slowly, each step taking you deeper into a layer of history that was never meant to be underground. And when you reach the bottom, you find yourself in a space that still bears the marks of its original purpose. The ceiling is vaulted, supported by columns carved with decorative patterns that would never have been placed in a utilitarian basement. The walls are finished with plaster and paint, now peeling and water-stained, but still showing traces of colors that suggest these rooms were once meant to be seen, to be inhabited, to be part of the life of the building rather than hidden beneath it. And most tellingly, there are windows, tall arched openings that now look out onto nothing but packed earth and the foundations of the modern street above. but which once, clearly, opened onto daylight and air. You run your hand along the stone sill of one of these buried windows, feeling the weathering, the erosion that comes from exposure to rain and wind, elements that should never have touched a basement window. The glass is long gone, replaced by boards or simply left as empty openings, but the frames remain, and they tell a story that the official explanations struggle to accommodate. City planners and historians will tell you that urban areas frequently raised their street levels in the 19th century, that this was a common practice to improve drainage, to accommodate new infrastructure like sewage systems and water mains, to create more usable space as populations grew and buildings became taller. And certainly there is some truth to this. Cities did undertake such projects, but the scale of what you are seeing here, repeated in city after city across multiple continents, suggests something more dramatic, something that affected the entire world, rather than just isolated urban centers making independent decisions about their infrastructure. The phenomenon has a name among those who study these anomalies, though it is a name that makes academics uncomfortable and draws dismissive responses from mainstream historians. They call it the mud flood, a hypothetical catastrophe that supposedly struck sometime in the early to mid-19th century, submerging the ground floors of buildings across the world under layers of earth and sediment. The idea sounds absurd at first, the kind of thing that belongs to fringe theories and internet speculation, rather than serious historical inquiry. But then you stand in these buried spaces, you examine the photographs from that era, and you begin to notice patterns that are difficult to explain away. In images from the 1860s and 1870s, you see streets covered in mud and debris to a depth of 10 or 15 feet, piled against buildings, covering doorways, reaching halfway up first-floor windows. You see people standing on these elevated surfaces, looking down at what used to be street level, their expressions suggesting not surprise, but weary acceptance, as though this is simply the world they have inherited and must now navigate. In San Francisco, in photographs taken after the 1906 earthquake, but before the subsequent fire, you can see buildings leaning at odd angles, their foundations exposed, revealing that they extend much deeper into the ground than their visible stories would suggest. In some images, you can count 3 or 4 levels below what appears to be the ground floor, spaces that must have been above ground when the buildings were constructed, but which have since been buried. The official explanation is that the earthquake caused settling, that the soft soil of the Bay Area allowed buildings to sink. But this does not account for the uniform depth of burial across so many structures, or for the fact that similar patterns appear in cities built on solid bedrock, on hillsides, on terrain that should not allow for such dramatic settling. Something covered these buildings, something that came from above or was pushed up from below. And whatever it was, it happened on a scale that suggests a global rather than local phenomenon. You climb back up the stairs, emerging into the modern street level, and look around with new eyes at the city surrounding you. How much of what you see is built on top of something older? How many layers of civilization lie beneath the asphalt and concrete, waiting to be rediscovered or deliberately kept hidden? In European cities, where construction projects sometimes uncover medieval foundations or Roman ruins, there is a sense that history is deep, that the past accumulates in layers like sediment. But in American cities, which are supposed to be young, where most buildings date from the 19th century or later, the discovery of buried levels creates a different kind of cognitive dissonance. If these cities were built on empty land by pioneers and settlers starting from scratch, why do their oldest structures show evidence of being partially submerged? Who built the original ground floors, and why were they buried? Some researchers point to specific events as possible triggers for such a catastrophe. The eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia in 1815, which caused what historians call the year without a summer, disrupting weather patterns across the globe, causing crop failures and social unrest. Or perhaps the series of powerful earthquakes that struck various regions in the early 19th century, any one of which might have triggered tsunamis, floods, or landslides on an unprecedented scale. But none of these events, dramatic as they were, seem sufficient to explain the global pattern of buried buildings, the consistent depth of coverage, the way entire urban areas seem to have been reset to a new elevation. Unless, of course, there was not a single catastrophic event, but a series of them, or a longer period of instability during which the surface of the Earth was in flux, rising and falling, covering and uncovering, until finally settling into the configuration we now take for granted. There is another possibility, one that sounds even more fantastical, but which gains a strange kind of plausibility the more evidence you examine. What if the mud flood was not a natural disaster at all, but a deliberate act, a way of burying evidence of a previous civilization that was too advanced, too different, too inconvenient to be allowed to remain visible? If Tartaria, or whatever we choose to call that lost empire, had developed technologies based on principles we no longer understand, if their buildings were designed to resonate with frequencies we have forgotten how to generate, if their entire infrastructure was incompatible with the coal and steam industrial model that was being imposed across the world, then perhaps the easiest way to eliminate that alternative was simply to bury it, to cover it with enough earth that future generations would never think to dig down and ask what came before. It sounds like paranoia, like the worst kind of conspiracy thinking, until you remember that history is written by those who survive, that narratives are controlled by those who have the power to control them, and that entire civilizations have been erased from memory before, with nothing more than the systematic destruction of their records and the patient rewriting of the story. In the archives, you find accounts from the mid-19th century that describe massive urban reconstruction projects undertaken with surprising speed and efficiency. Cities that were supposedly primitive, barely more than frontier towns, suddenly acquired sophisticated infrastructure, paved streets, gas lighting, running water, sewage systems, all within the span of a decade or two. The official explanation is that this was the result of industrialization, of new technologies and engineering techniques that allowed for rapid development. But when you look at the scale of what was accomplished, at the precision of the construction, at the architectural sophistication of the buildings that appeared during this period, it becomes harder to believe that all of this emerged from nothing, that it was created whole from the minds of engineers who had no models to work from, no existing infrastructure to study and replicate. It seems more plausible that they were restoring, repairing, adapting structures and systems that already existed, but which had been damaged or buried. That the Industrial Revolution was in part an excavation project, uncovering and repurposing the remnants of an earlier civilization. The buried windows, the submerged doorways, the impossible depths of basements that were never designed to be underground. All of these point toward a moment of discontinuity, a break in the historical record where something fundamental changed. And if you accept that such a break occurred, then you must also accept that everything we think we know about the 19th century, about the origins of our modern infrastructure, about the trajectory of technological development, might be built on a foundation of half-truths and deliberate omissions. The world we inhabit is not the first version of modernity. It is a reconstruction, a second draft, built on the bones of something that came before and was either destroyed by catastrophe or deliberately erased to make room for a new order, a new way of organizing society, a new relationship between humanity and the earth that would prove more extractive, more destructive, but also more controllable, more profitable for those who stood to benefit from it. You walk through the streets now with a different kind of attention, noticing the small anomalies that most people pass by without seeing. A doorway that leads down instead of up. Steps descending into what should be a ground floor entrance, but which now opens into darkness. A window at ankle height, its pane dirty and cracked, looking into a space that might once have been a shop or a residence, but is now just a forgotten cavity beneath the modern city. The evidence is everywhere once you start looking for it. Traces of a world that was covered over so thoroughly that even its existence has become a matter of speculation and doubt. But the buildings remember, even if we have forgotten. The stones still bear the marks of their original purpose. The walls still resonate with frequencies that no longer have names. And somewhere beneath our feet, in the buried levels we have chosen not to excavate, the old world waits in silence, patient as earth itself, knowing that sooner or later someone will dig deep enough to ask the questions that were supposed to remain unasked. What if the ground beneath us is not stable, but layered, not solid, but palimpsest, with each stratum recording a different version of reality, a different configuration of the world? What if the catastrophe that buried those buildings was not the end of something, but the beginning? The moment when one age ended and another began. When the resonant civilization of Tartaria gave way to the combustive civilization of modernity. And what if we are living now, in the twilight of that second age, approaching another moment of discontinuity, another reset, when the surface of the world will shift again, and what we have built will become the buried layer for some future archaeologist to discover and puzzle over? The thought is unsettling, vertiginous, like standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing that the ground extends both up and down further than you can see. But it is also strangely liberating, because if the world has been reset before, if civilizations have risen and fallen and been covered over and forgotten, then perhaps the future is not as fixed as we imagine. Perhaps the trajectory we are on is not inevitable. Perhaps there are other ways of being that we have not yet remembered how to see. If you have ever stood in a basement and felt the presence of something older pressing against the walls, if you have walked down a street and noticed windows half buried in earth and wondered what they once looked at, then you know the feeling I am describing. The sense that history is not a line, but a spiral, not a progression, but a series of returns. And if that resonates with you, if you feel it in your bones rather than just thinking it in your mind, then simply write the word "continue" in the comments, and I will know that you are ready to go deeper, to follow this thread down into the buried places where the old world still hums with its forgotten song, waiting for someone to remember how to listen. Chapter 4. The Resonance Technology. You stand at the center of a great domed cathedral, one of those structures that survived the fires and demolitions of the 19th century. And you do something that most visitors never think to do. You remain absolutely still and silent, waiting for the ambient noise to fade, for the shuffling feet and whispered conversations of tourists to drift away, until the space around you settles into a kind of expectant quietness. The air inside is cool, perhaps 61 degrees Fahrenheit, and surprisingly dry, despite the massive volume of the interior. The dome rises above you to a height of nearly 200 feet, its surface decorated with geometric patterns that seem to spiral inward toward the oculus at the apex. And as you tilt your head back to follow these patterns, you notice something that the guidebooks do not mention. The decorations are not random or purely aesthetic. They follow mathematical progressions, ratios that repeat at different scales. The same relationships you would find in musical intervals, in the harmonic series, in the frequencies that define how sound moves through space and resonates within enclosed volumes. You take a breath and produce a single note, a tone from deep in your chest, letting it rise naturally, without forcing or shaping it. The sound leaves your mouth, and immediately, something extraordinary happens. The note does not simply travel outward and fade as it would in an ordinary room. Instead, it seems to catch on something invisible in the air, to gather strength as it rises, to multiply and harmonize with itself until the entire space is filled with a chord that you did not sing. Overtones and undertones generated by the geometry of the building itself. The sound lasts for nearly 30 seconds after you stop producing it, hanging in the air like a visible presence. And you can feel it not just in your ears, but in your chest, in your bones, in the soles of your feet where they touch the stone floor. The building is not simply containing sound, it is participating in it, transforming a single human voice into a chorus, amplifying certain frequencies while dampening others, creating harmonies that seem to emerge from the walls themselves. This is not architecture designed merely to impress or inspire. This is architecture designed to resonate, to interact with sound in specific, calculated ways, to turn structure into instrument. Modern acoustic engineers who have studied these spaces describe them with a mixture of admiration and frustration, because the effects they produce are extraordinarily difficult to replicate using contemporary materials and construction techniques. The precise curves of the domes, the thickness and composition of the walls, the placement of pillars and arches, the dimensions of every surface, all of these factors combine to create acoustic properties that seem almost magical in their sophistication. A whisper at one end of the nave can be heard clearly at the altar 200 feet away, while ordinary conversation in the central aisle seems to be absorbed and muffled. Certain notes, sung from specific positions, will cause the entire structure to vibrate sympathetically, as though the building were a giant tuning fork responding to the correct frequency. These are not accidents. These are the results of knowledge, of understanding, of a science of sound and resonance that the builders possessed and that we have largely forgotten. You walk slowly around the perimeter of the space, running your hand along the stone pillars, feeling the subtle vibrations that remain even in silence, the way the building seems to hum at frequencies just below the threshold of hearing. And you begin to notice other details that suggest purpose beyond the spiritual or ceremonial. The pillars are not solid stone but hollow, their interiors forming cavities that connect to channels running through the walls and beneath the floor. The windows are positioned not just to admit light, but to create specific patterns of airflow, pressure differentials that would cause the entire structure to breathe, to draw air in through some openings and expel it through others in a continuous, self-regulating cycle. The dome itself is not a single shell but multiple layers, each one separated by a small gap, creating what modern engineers would recognize as a resonant cavity, a space designed to trap and amplify specific frequencies while allowing others to pass through or be absorbed. Every element of the building seems to serve multiple functions, structural and acoustic, and perhaps something else, some purpose that we no longer have words for, because we no longer understand the principles on which it was based. If Tartaria truly existed, if it was the civilization responsible for spreading this architectural knowledge across the world, then these buildings are its most enduring legacy, the evidence that refuses to be completely erased. And what they suggest is that the Tartarians understood something fundamental about the relationship between geometry, sound, and energy. Something that allowed them to build structures that were not just shelters or monuments, but technologies, devices for manipulating the invisible forces that surround us. Consider the towers that crown so many of these buildings, the spiraling spires topped with metallic ornaments shaped like crescents, stars, or complex geometric forms. The official explanation is that these are religious symbols, decorative flourishes that identify the function or denomination of the building. But when you examine them more closely, when you note the materials used in their construction, the copper and iron and sometimes gold, the way they are positioned to rise above the surrounding structures and extend into the open sky, they begin to look less like symbols and more like antennas, devices designed to capture or transmit something, to interact with the electrical and magnetic fields that permeate the atmosphere. In the late 19th century, before the science of electromagnetism became dominated by coal-fired generators and copper wire transmission lines, there was a brief period when inventors and researchers explored alternative approaches to generating and distributing electrical energy. They spoke of the ether, a subtle medium that filled all space and through which energy could propagate without the need for physical conductors. They built towers topped with copper spheres and elaborate geometric frameworks, structures that look remarkably similar to the spires that crown Tartarian architecture, and they claimed to be able to draw power directly from the atmosphere, to light lamps and run motors without any visible source of energy. Nikola Tesla was perhaps the most famous of these researchers, and his tower at Wardenclyffe, though never completed, was designed on principles that echo the architecture you are standing in now. He spoke of the Earth itself as a conductor, of the atmosphere as an ocean of energy waiting to be tapped, of the possibility of transmitting power wirelessly to any point on the planet by tuning into the natural resonance of the Earth's electromagnetic field. His ideas were suppressed, his funding cut off, his tower demolished. And the official story is that his approach was impractical, that it could not compete with the efficiency of centralized power generation and wired distribution networks. But what if the real reason for the suppression was not impracticality, but incompatibility? A technology that allows anyone to draw energy freely from the atmosphere cannot be metered, cannot be controlled, cannot be used to generate profit or consolidate power. A civilization built on such technology would operate according to fundamentally different principles than one built on the extraction and combustion of fossil fuels. It would be a civilization of abundance rather than scarcity, of distribution rather than accumulation, of harmony rather than exploitation. And such a civilization would be an existential threat to anyone who sought to build an economy based on controlling access to energy, on making people dependent on centralized systems that could be owned and operated for profit. Perhaps this is what Tartaria represented, and perhaps this is why it had to be erased so thoroughly. Not because it was primitive or backward, but because it was too advanced. Because it had solved problems in ways that were incompatible with the industrial model that was being imposed across the world. The great domed buildings, the towers with their metallic spires, the geometric precision of their proportions, All of these suggest a civilization that had learned to work with resonance, with frequency, with the subtle energies that modern science acknowledges, but has largely abandoned in favor of cruder, more controllable forms of power. And if those buildings were not just beautiful but functional, if they were part of a global network of energy generation and distribution, then their destruction and burial would have been not just a political act, but a technological one. A way of dismantling a system that threatened to make the emerging industrial order obsolete before it could fully establish itself. You leave the cathedral and step back out into the modern city, where power lines stretch between poles, where generators burn fossil fuels to produce electricity that flows through copper wires to light buildings and run machines. The system works in its way, but it is loud and dirty, and requires constant extraction of resources from the earth, constant labor to maintain and expand. You cannot help but contrast it with the silent elegance of the building you just left, with the way it seemed to draw energy from the air itself, to resonate with forces that required no fuel, no combustion, no waste. The technology was there, encoded in the architecture, preserved in stone and metal and geometric proportion. But we have forgotten how to read it, how to activate it, how to tune ourselves to the frequencies it was designed to amplify. The fall of Tartaria, if it truly occurred, was not just the collapse of an empire, but the silencing of a symphony, the destruction of a world that sang in harmony with the earth, and the replacement of that song with the harsh mechanical rhythms of industry. Some researchers claim that traces of this old technology can still be found, if you know where to look and what to measure. They point to anomalous electromagnetic readings taken inside certain old buildings, to subtle vibrations that seem to have no source, to the way some structures seem to affect the mood and consciousness of people who spend time in them, inducing states of calm or clarity, or heightened awareness that cannot be explained by psychology alone. They speak of ley lines, of dragon veins, of the ancient practice of geomancy, not as superstition, but as a kind of proto-science, a way of mapping and working with energy flows in the earth that we have lost the ability to perceive. And they suggest that the Tartarian builders were masters of this science, that they positioned their structures at points where these energy lines intersected, where the natural resonance of the earth was strongest, and that they designed their buildings to amplify and harness that resonance for purposes we can only guess at now. The idea sounds like fantasy, like New Age mysticism grafted onto historical speculation, until you remember that every ancient civilization, from the Egyptians to the Chinese to the Maya, placed enormous importance on the precise alignment and positioning of their most important structures. They used astronomy and mathematics and principles of sacred geometry to determine where and how to build. And they claimed that these practices were not merely symbolic, but functional, that they allowed their buildings to tap into cosmic forces, to serve as bridges between earth and sky, between the material and the immaterial. Modern science dismisses these claims as superstition, as the product of minds that did not yet understand physics or chemistry or biology. But what if the ancients understood something that we have forgotten, not because they were more primitive, but because they approached the world with different assumptions, different tools, different ways of perceiving and measuring reality? What if resonance, frequency, and vibration are not just properties of sound and electromagnetic radiation, but fundamental organizing principles of the universe itself? And what if there was once a civilization that learned to work consciously with these principles, to build technologies based on harmony rather than force, on attunement rather than extraction? If Tartaria was that civilization, then the buildings it left behind are more than ruins or monuments. They are messages, instructions encoded in stone, waiting for a time when humanity is ready to remember what was lost, to ask the questions that were buried along with the evidence. The domes still stand, the towers still rise against the sky, the geometric patterns still decorate the walls. And somewhere in the ratios and proportions and acoustic properties of these spaces, the old knowledge waits, patient as stone, silent as the frequency that lies just beyond the range of human hearing. You can feel it when you stand in the center of those domed spaces, when you let yourself become still enough to notice the subtle hum that seems to emerge from nowhere and everywhere at once. It is the sound of the building remembering what it was built to do, the resonance that was once part of a living network spanning continents, and now exists only in isolated fragments, in structures that survive more by accident than by design, singing quietly to themselves in a world that has forgotten how to listen. If you have ever stood in an old building and felt it vibrate with a sound you could not quite hear, if you have ever sensed that architecture might be more than shelter, more than art, more than the dead arrangement of stone and wood, then you know what I am describing. You know that there is something waiting to be remembered, something that our civilization set aside in its rush toward mechanization and control. And if that knowing feels real to you, if it touches something deeper than intellectual curiosity, then write the word calm in the comments, and I will understand that you are still here, still listening, still willing to follow this investigation into the places where forgotten science and suppressed history and the resonant memory of the earth itself all converge. Chapter 5. The Great Fires. There was a photograph from San Francisco, taken in April of 1906, just after the earthquake, but before the fires that would consume the city. The image shows Market Street, and what strikes you immediately is not the damage from the quake, but the strange selectivity of the destruction. Wooden buildings have collapsed into piles of lumber and debris, but standing among them, seemingly untouched, are massive stone structures, their facades blackened but intact, their windows empty, but their walls still vertical, still strong. The streets are unnaturally clean, swept clear of the rubble you would expect to see after such a catastrophe. And in the distance, smoke is already beginning to rise. The first fingers of the fire that will, over the next 3 days, burn through more than 25,000 buildings and leave 200,000 people homeless. The official story is that the fire was a consequence of the earthquake, that broken gas lines and overturned stoves ignited in hundreds of places simultaneously, that the flames spread uncontrollably because water mains had been shattered and firefighters were helpless to stop the conflagration. But when you examine the photographs taken after the fire, when you study the patterns of destruction, something does not quite fit the narrative. The temperature in the aftermath must have been extraordinary. Stone buildings show signs of vitrification, their surfaces melted and refrozen into glassy textures that normally require temperatures above 1800 degrees Fahrenheit to produce. Iron beams are twisted and drooping, their molecular structure compromised by heat that exceeded the melting point of the metal itself. And yet, surrounding these intensely burned areas, you find wooden structures that survived, trees with leaves still green, paper documents lying in the street, barely singed. The fire, it seems, did not spread in the way fires normally spread, consuming everything in its path with democratic indifference. It burned in patterns, in channels, selectively destroying some structures, while leaving others nearby completely untouched. The official explanation is wind patterns, fire breaks, the heroic efforts of firefighters who managed to save certain neighborhoods. But the selectivity is too precise, too consistent, to be explained by such random factors. It is as though the fire knew what it was supposed to destroy and followed that instruction with mechanical efficiency. San Francisco was not unique. Chicago burned in 1871, and the Great Fire, as it is still called, consumed more than 3 square miles of the city center in less than 2 days. The fire supposedly started in a barn, sparked by a cow kicking over a lantern, and from that humble beginning grew into an inferno that killed 300 people and left 100,000 homeless. But contemporary accounts describe details that do not match the behavior of ordinary fire. Witnesses spoke of flames that seemed to leap across wide streets without any obvious fuel source, of stone buildings that exploded rather than burned, of a heat so intense that it melted metal and glass, but left some wooden structures standing. In the aftermath, as in San Francisco, the streets were strangely clean, as though something had not just burned, but vaporized the debris, leaving behind only the skeletal remains of the largest buildings. And within a year, the city had been rebuilt, not gradually or piecemeal, but systematically, with new architecture, new street layouts, new infrastructure that appeared with a speed that seems impossible given the scale of the destruction. Boston burned in 1872, Baltimore in 1904, Toronto in 1904, Seattle in 1889. Each fire followed a similar pattern, starting suddenly, spreading rapidly, burning with unusual intensity, leaving behind a curiously selective pattern of destruction. And in each case, the rebuilding was swift and comprehensive, transforming the urban landscape almost overnight, replacing the old architectural styles with something newer, more standardized, more industrial. The official histories treat these fires as tragedies, as accidents, as natural consequences of urban growth in an era before modern fire codes and firefighting equipment. But when you map them, when you note the timing and the locations and the results, a different pattern begins to emerge. The fires cluster in the late 19th century, the exact period when the evidence of Tartaria was disappearing from maps and archives, when the buried buildings were being covered over, when the old world was being systematically erased and replaced with the new. You find yourself looking at a photograph of Chicago after the fire, at the ruins of what was supposedly a newly built city, and what you see does not match what you have been told. The buildings that remain standing, the ones made of stone rather than wood, show weathering and erosion that suggests far greater age than the official dates of their construction. Their foundations extend deep into the earth, multiple stories below street level, far deeper than would be necessary or practical for buildings erected just a few decades earlier. Their architectural style is ornate, sophisticated, reminiscent of European palaces or Central Asian mosques, not the simple utilitarian structures you would expect from a frontier city built by American pioneers in the middle of the 19th century. They look, in other words, like Tartarian architecture, like buildings that belong to an older, more advanced civilization. And the fire that supposedly destroyed Chicago looks less like an accident and more like a clearing operation, a way of removing the old to make room for the new, a way of erasing evidence that these cities were not built from scratch, but were inherited, occupied, repurposed from something that existed before. There are other anomalies, details that whisper of technologies beyond the official capabilities of the era. Some researchers have noted that the patterns of destruction in these great fires resemble what modern military analysts would recognize as the effects of directed energy weapons. of focused beams of electromagnetic radiation that can generate intense heat in targeted areas, while leaving surrounding regions relatively unaffected. The idea sounds absurd, like science fiction projected backward onto history, until you remember that the late 19th century was a period of extraordinary experimentation with electricity, magnetism, and radiation. That inventors were building devices whose principles we still do not fully understand. That the boundary between science and speculation was far more fluid than it would become in the 20th century. Tesla spoke of death rays and wireless energy transmission. Other inventors, whose names have been largely forgotten, filed patents for devices that claim to harness atmospheric electricity, to focus and direct electromagnetic fields, to produce effects that sound impossible, but which were apparently demonstrated to witnesses who recorded their observations in journals and newspapers that still exist in archives. What if some of these devices were not just theoretical, but functional? What if, in the rush to industrialize, to modernize, to impose a new order on the world, those in power decided that certain structures, certain technologies, certain ways of organizing space and generating energy had to be eliminated? Fire is a convenient tool for such elimination. It destroys evidence. It creates chaos that allows for rapid redevelopment without public scrutiny. It provides cover for the introduction of new systems that might otherwise be questioned or resisted. And if the fires could be blamed on accidents, on natural causes, on the inevitable hazards of urban life in that era, then no one would think to ask whether they were deliberate, whether they served a purpose beyond the immediate destruction. The cities would rebuild, and in rebuilding, they would forget what had been there before, would accept the new architecture as though it had always been the only option, would never know that they were walking through spaces that had been cleared and reset, written over like a palimpsest, whose earlier text had been scraped away to make room for a different story. In the photographs of these post-fire cities, you notice something else that disturbs you. The rebuilding is too uniform, too coordinated. Buildings rise in rows, their facades matching, their heights aligned, their styles conforming to a standard that seems imposed rather than organic. There is none of the architectural diversity you would expect from individual property owners hiring different architects and builders, each making independent decisions about how to reconstruct. Instead, the new cities look planned, designed, as though someone had drawn up blueprints for entire neighborhoods and then implemented those plans with machine-like precision. The official explanation is that city governments, learning from the fires, imposed new building codes and zoning regulations that required certain materials, certain setbacks, certain safety features. But the speed and thoroughness of the transformation suggests something more, suggests that the fires were not disasters to be recovered from, but opportunities to be exploited. Chances to remake the urban landscape according to a vision that prioritized control, standardization, and compatibility with the industrial systems that were being installed. And what of the people who lived in these cities, who survived the fires and returned to find their homes gone, their neighborhoods transformed, their memories no longer matching the physical reality around them? Some of them must have noticed the inconsistencies, must have wondered why the rebuilding happened so quickly, why the new structures looked nothing like what had been there before, why the official histories seemed to skip over certain details, or explain them in ways that did not quite make sense. But memory is fragile, especially collective memory, especially when it is not reinforced by physical evidence, by buildings and streets and landmarks that remain constant across generations. When everything changes at once, when the familiar is replaced by the unfamiliar in the span of a few years, It becomes difficult to hold on to the past, difficult to trust your own recollections against the confident assertions of authorities who tell you that what you remember never existed, that the new version is the true version, that history is what the documents say it is, rather than what you experienced. You think of the buried windows again, the submerged doorways, the layers of cities stacked on top of each other, and you begin to see a pattern that connects the mudfloods and the great fires, the erased maps and the demolished exposition buildings. They are all part of the same process, the same systematic erasure of a previous world to make room for the current one. The methods vary: mud and fire and demolition and renaming. But the goal is consistent: to eliminate evidence of what came before, to create a clean break between past and present, to ensure that each new generation grows up believing that the world they inhabit is the only world that ever existed, or at least the only world worth remembering. And if that process required the destruction of beautiful buildings, of advanced technologies, of knowledge that took centuries to accumulate, then so be it. Progress, after all, demands sacrifice. Modernity requires the clearing away of the old. The new age cannot coexist with the old, not when they are built on incompatible principles, not when one represents abundance and the other scarcity, one harmony and the other extraction, one the song of resonance and the other the roar of combustion. The fires burned, the cities rose from the ashes, and within a generation, hardly anyone remembered what had been lost. The children born in the new cities grew up with no knowledge of the old ones, with no reason to question the story they were told about progress and development and the inevitable march of civilization toward greater sophistication. They walked past the surviving stone buildings, the ones too solid to burn, and saw them as relics of their own recent past, rather than as fragments of something far older and more mysterious. The possibility that their cities had been inherited rather than built, that the ground beneath their feet was layered with the remains of previous versions of reality, never occurred to them, because the story did not allow for such possibilities, because the narrative had been constructed specifically to foreclose those questions. And so the forgetting was complete, sealed by fire, buried under ash, paved over with new streets that led only forward, never back. But fire does not destroy everything. Stone remembers. Metal remembers. The patterns encoded in architecture, the ratios and proportions and geometric relationships, these survive even when the purpose they served has been forgotten. And in the quiet moments, when you stand before one of those blackened but unbroken facades, when you trace the vitrified stone with your fingers and feel the residual heat of a fire that burned more than a century ago, you can sense it, the presence of what was lost, the echo of a world that refused to die completely, that left these fragments behind as evidence, as testimony, as a silent accusation against those who thought they could erase it entirely. The fires were meant to be final, meant to close the door on the past forever. But they were not final. Nothing ever is. The past survives in the margins, in the anomalies, in the details that do not quite fit, waiting for someone to notice. to question, to remember on behalf of all those who were made to forget. If you feel that heat, if you can sense the presence of those old flames still burning in the spaces between what we know and what we are told, then leave the word "still" in the comments below, and I will know that you have stayed with me this far, that you are willing to keep walking through the ashes toward whatever truth lies buried beneath them, patient and terrible, and waiting to be uncovered. Chapter 6. World's Fairs and Demolition. In the summer of 1893, more than 27 million people visited the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, walking through a temporary city of white buildings that covered more than 600 acres along the shore of Lake Michigan. The official story is that this spectacular fairground, with its grand palaces, ornate fountains, and towering monuments, was constructed in just 3 years using a material called staff, a mixture of plaster, fiber, and cement that could be molded into elaborate shapes and painted to resemble marble. The exposition was meant to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the Americas, to showcase American achievement and technological progress, to demonstrate that the young nation could rival the cultural sophistication of Europe. For 6 months, the White City, as it was called, stood as a vision of what urban planning and architecture could achieve. And then, within a year of the fair's closing, it was gone, demolished so thoroughly that almost nothing remained, as though it had been nothing more than a dream that dissolved in daylight. You stand now in Jackson Park, where the exposition once spread its marble glory, and try to imagine what it looked like. The photographs that survive show a cityscape that seems impossible, buildings that rival the great palaces of Europe, rising along carefully planned boulevards, their facades covered in classical ornamentation, their proportions suggesting not temporary structures, but monuments built to endure for centuries. There is the Manufactures and Liberal Arts Building, at the time the largest building in the world, covering more than 30 acres under a single roof. Its interior space so vast that it could have held the Capitol Building, the Great Pyramid, Winchester Cathedral, Madison Square Garden, and St. Paul's Cathedral, all at once. There is the Administration Building, with its golden dome rising 275 feet into the air, its exterior covered in sculptures and reliefs that would have taken master craftsmen years to complete. There are the State Pavilions, each one a small palace in its own right, and the Court of Honor, where fountains played among classical colonnades, and the Transportation Building with its great golden doorway, and dozens of other structures, each one appearing to be made of solid stone, each one photographed from multiple angles, shown filled with visitors, documented in journals and newspapers and official reports. The temperature on opening day was 72 degrees Fahrenheit, the sky clear, the atmosphere festive. President Grover Cleveland pressed a button that activated machinery throughout the fairgrounds. Fountains began to flow, flags unfurled, and the crowds surged forward to explore the White City. For the next 6 months, the exposition operated as a fully functioning municipality, with its own transportation system, its own power generation, its own water supply and sewage treatment, its own police force and fire department. Visitors arrived by train and boat, paid their admission of 50 cents, and spent days wandering through exhibitions that displayed the latest technologies, the newest inventions, the products of dozens of nations. They rode the first Ferris wheel, watched electricity illuminate buildings at night, observed demonstrations of telephones and phonographs and kinetoscopes. They ate in restaurants, slept in hotels, attended concerts and lectures, and moved through spaces that felt more real, more substantial, more permanent than the word temporary could possibly convey. And then it ended. The fair closed in October 1893, and the demolition began almost immediately. The official explanation is that the buildings were always meant to be temporary, that stath was a fragile material, unsuited for permanent architecture, that the structures were already deteriorating by the end of the exposition and had to be removed before they became dangerous. But when you look at the photographs of the demolition, something does not quite fit. The buildings do not crumble or collapse the way plaster structures should. They have to be torn down piece by piece, using heavy equipment and crews of workers wielding sledgehammers and crowbars, as though they were made of something far more substantial than the official story suggests. And the debris that results from this demolition is not the dust and fragments you would expect from plaster and fiber. It looks like stone, like brick, like materials that were meant to last. Some photographs show walls 3 feet thick being torn apart, foundations extending deep into the earth being excavated, structural elements that seem far more robust than temporary construction would require. There is another detail that troubles you as you examine these images. The buildings, supposedly constructed between 1890 and 1893, already show signs of weathering in the photographs taken during the exposition itself. The white surfaces are stained and darkened in places. The ornamentation shows erosion at the edges. The overall appearance suggests decades of exposure to wind and rain, rather than just a few years. Some researchers have suggested that the exposition was not built from scratch, but was instead a repurposing of existing structures, buildings that were already there, perhaps buried or partially destroyed, that were uncovered, restored, and temporarily occupied before being demolished to hide the evidence of their true age and origin. It sounds far-fetched until you remember the mud floods, the buried windows, the pattern of cities being reset and rebuilt. If Chicago, like other American cities, was built on top of an older civilization, then perhaps the exposition was the moment when that older layer was briefly revealed before being hastily covered over again. The pattern repeats with unsettling consistency. In Paris in 1900, another massive exposition filled the Champ de Mars with elaborate structures, including the Grand Palais and Petit Palais. Buildings supposedly made of temporary materials, but which looked and functioned like permanent architecture. Most were demolished after the fair, but a few, inexplicably, were allowed to remain, reclassified as permanent structures, despite being built with the same methods and materials as the temporary ones. In St. Louis in 1904, the Louisiana Purchase Exposition created another White City, this one covering more than 1,200 acres, featuring buildings that photographs show to be massive, ornate, sophisticated. The fair attracted nearly 20 million visitors over 7 months, and then, like its predecessors, it was torn down, leaving only a few structures behind. Scattered remnants of what was supposedly the largest fair ever held. In San Francisco in 1915, the Panama Pacific International Exposition rose along the northern waterfront, another temporary city of palaces and towers, and within 2 years it too was demolished, as though the entire enterprise had been designed not to preserve, but to destroy, not to celebrate, but to erase. You begin to notice something else about these expositions. They cluster in the years following the Great Fires, as though there is a connection between the destruction and the fairs, as though one leads inevitably to the other. Chicago burns in 1871, and by 1893, It is hosting the World's Columbian Exposition. San Francisco burns in 1906, and by 1915, it is hosting the Panama Pacific Exposition. The official narrative treats these as separate events, the fires as tragedies, and the fairs as triumphs, evidence of the city's resilience and capacity for renewal. But when you map them, when you note the timing and the locations, another possibility emerges. Perhaps the fires were not followed by fairs. Perhaps the fairs were the reason for the fires, or at least part of the same process. A coordinated effort to clear away the old and temporarily reveal it under controlled circumstances before burying it again under the new. The expositions would serve multiple purposes. They would generate revenue. They would attract international attention. They would showcase American progress and ambition. But they would also provide cover for the demolition of structures that were too large, too sophisticated, too inexplicable to be allowed to remain visible. Consider the logistics of what was supposedly accomplished. The Chicago Exposition required the construction of more than 200 buildings covering 600 acres in just 3 years. The amount of material, the number of workers, the coordination required, all of this strains credibility when you consider that Chicago in 1890 was still recovering from the fire of 1871, that it did not have the established construction industry or architectural infrastructure that such a project would require. And yet the buildings appeared, massive and complete, photographed from every angle, visited by millions, and then disappeared again almost as quickly. The official records show expenditures, lists of contractors, descriptions of construction techniques. But when you examine these documents closely, they raise more questions than they answer. The budgets seem too small for the scale of the work. The timelines seem too compressed. The descriptions of materials and methods do not quite match what the photographs show. It is as though the official story was constructed after the fact, designed to explain something that had already happened in ways that made sense within the accepted narrative of progress and industrial capability, even if the explanation required glossing over inconvenient details. And then there is the question of what happened to all the artifacts, all the exhibits, all the contents of these vast exposition halls. Millions of objects were displayed at these fairs, products and artworks and technological demonstrations from around the world, many of them unique, many of them valuable. The official story is that after the expositions closed, these items were returned to their owners, sold to collectors, or donated to museums. But the records of what went where are surprisingly sparse, surprisingly incomplete. Large quantities of material simply vanish from the historical record, as though they were absorbed into the demolition, buried along with the buildings, removed from circulation to prevent questions about their origins or their implications. Some researchers have suggested that certain exhibits were not contemporary products at all, but artifacts recovered from the buried levels of cities, from the ruins of Tartarian civilization, briefly displayed under the guise of modern innovation before being destroyed or hidden away in private collections where they would never be subjected to serious scientific analysis. The architecture of the expositions themselves provides clues. Despite being supposedly temporary, despite being built in different cities at different times by different teams of architects and engineers, the buildings share a remarkable stylistic consistency. They employ the same neoclassical vocabulary, the same proportions, the same decorative elements. But beneath that superficial uniformity, you can see traces of something else, echoes of the architectural language you have come to recognize as Tartarian. The domes, the arches, the geometric patterns, the attention to acoustic properties and resonance, all of these appear in the exposition buildings, as though the architects were working from older models, adapting and simplifying designs that originated elsewhere and elsewhen. The white cities were white because plaster is white, because the material allowed for rapid construction and dramatic effect. But perhaps they were also white because they were covering something. Whitewashing in the most literal sense. Applying a fresh coat over surfaces that bore the marks of greater age and different origins. There is a photograph from the St. Louis Exposition that you return to again and again, unable to shake the feeling that it contains some essential truth, if you could only learn to see it properly. The image shows the Palace of Machinery, a vast hall with a vaulted ceiling supported by ranks of columns. Its interior filled with exhibits of engines and turbines and generators. All the machinery of industrial progress. But what catches your attention is not the machinery, but the building itself. The way the light falls through the high windows, the quality of the space, the proportions that create acoustic effects you can almost hear just by looking at the photograph. This is not a temporary structure thrown together for a fair. This is a cathedral, a temple, a building designed with knowledge and purpose that transcends mere exhibition. And within a year, it would be torn down, reduced to rubble, its fragments scattered or buried, its existence relegated to photographs and memories that would fade until most people forgot it had ever been there at all. You walk through Jackson Park now, more than a century after the White City rose and fell, and try to feel the presence of what was here. The Museum of Science and Industry remains, the only major building from the exposition that was preserved, though even it had to be reconstructed. Its temporary materials replaced with permanent ones in a process that took decades and fundamentally altered its character. The rest is gone, replaced by grass and trees and pathways that bear no trace of the grand boulevards and marble palaces that once occupied this space. Occasionally, during construction projects or landscape maintenance, workers uncover fragments, pieces of foundation, chunks of decorative elements, bits of the White City that somehow survived the demolition. These are treated as curiosities, as historical artifacts to be preserved in storage or displayed in small museum cases, stripped of context, disconnected from the larger pattern they are part of. No one thinks to ask why so much effort went into building something that was designed to be destroyed, why millions were spent to create a vision of beauty and order that was never meant to last, why the demolition was so thorough that almost nothing remains. Unless, of course, the demolition was the point. Unless the fairs were never about celebration or education or progress, but about erasure, about the controlled destruction of evidence, about providing a cover story for the removal of structures that should not have been there, according to the official timeline of history. If that is true, then the world's fairs were not exhibitions but operations, carefully planned and executed, designed to allow the public to see and marvel at remnants of Tartarian civilization one last time, before those remnants were destroyed forever, before the reset was complete, before the new age could proceed without the inconvenient presence of the old. The photographs remain, thousands of them, showing buildings that seem too grand, too sophisticated, too permanent to have been temporary. They are evidence, testimony from a time when the erasure was still in process, when the old world was visible even as it was being dismantled. And they wait now in archives and online databases, challenging anyone who looks at them carefully to reconcile what they show with what we have been told about the past, about progress, about the inevitability of the present. If you have looked at those photographs, if you have felt the impossibility of what they depict, if you sense that the white cities were both more and less than what they claimed to be, then you are beginning to understand. You are beginning to see the pattern. And if you want to continue deeper into this investigation, if you are ready to follow the trail into even stranger territory, then simply write the word "continue" in the comments, and I will know that you are still here, still questioning, still willing to walk through the ruins of forgotten fairs toward whatever truth waits at the center of the labyrinth. Chapter 7. The Ether and Free Energy. In a laboratory in Colorado Springs in the summer of 1899, Nikola Tesla sits alone at night, surrounded by equipment that hums and crackles with energies that most people cannot see or understand. The temperature inside is warm, perhaps 82 degrees Fahrenheit. The air charged with ozone and the metallic scent of electrical discharge. Before him stands a massive coil, 12 feet in diameter, wound with hundreds of turns of copper wire, connected to a system of capacitors and transformers that he has designed according to principles he claims to have discovered in the resonant frequencies of the Earth itself. He throws a switch, and instantly the room fills with light, not from bulbs or lamps, but from the air itself, which glows with a pale violet luminescence, as though the atmosphere has become incandescent. Streamers of electricity arc between metal spheres positioned around the laboratory. 20 feet of empty space crossed by lightning that requires no clouds, no storm, no conventional source of power. Tesla stands in the center of this electrical tempest, his body serving as a conductor, and he is unharmed, protected by the frequencies he has tuned his equipment to generate, resonating with the currents rather than resisting them. He writes in his journal that night about what he is discovering, about the ether, the invisible medium that fills all space and through which all energy propagates. He describes it not as emptiness, but as an ocean, infinitely deep, vibrating at frequencies that permeate everything, connecting all points in the universe through resonance. He believes, and his experiments seem to confirm, that this ether can be tapped, that energy can be drawn from it without consumption, without depletion, without the need for fuel or combustion. His coil is designed to resonate with the natural frequencies of the Earth's electromagnetic field, to amplify those frequencies until they become strong enough to light lamps, run motors, transmit information across vast distances without wires. He speaks of a future in which every home, every factory, every vehicle will draw power directly from the ether, in which the extraction and burning of coal and oil will become obsolete, in which energy will be as freely available as the air we breathe. It is a vision of abundance so radical that it threatens the entire economic structure of the emerging industrial age. And that, perhaps, is why it was destroyed. Within a few years, Tesla's funding is cut off. His laboratory in Colorado is dismantled. His tower at Wardenclyffe, the great monument to wireless power transmission that he begins building on Long Island, is never completed. And what is built is eventually torn down, demolished under mysterious circumstances. The copper and equipment salvaged or scattered, the foundations broken up and buried. The official story is that his ideas were impractical, that wireless power transmission could not compete with the efficiency of centralized generation and wired distribution, that investors lost confidence when he failed to deliver immediate results. But when you study the details of what Tesla was attempting, when you read his patents and notebooks and correspondence, another possibility emerges. His technology was not impractical. It was dangerous, not to users, but to those who sought to control the emerging energy economy, to build empires based on the ownership and distribution of scarce resources. A world running on energy drawing freely from the ether is a world that cannot be metered, cannot be monopolized, cannot be used to generate the kind of concentrated wealth and power that the industrial barons of the late 19th century were accumulating. Tesla was not alone in his understanding of the ether and its possibilities. Throughout the 19th century, scientists and inventors across Europe and America worked with similar concepts, built similar devices, claimed to achieve similar results. They spoke of atmospheric electricity, of telluric currents, of the electrical nature of life itself. They built towers topped with copper spheres and elaborate antenna arrays, structures that look remarkably similar to the spires that crown Tartarian architecture. They demonstrated lamps that burned without connection to any visible power source, motors that ran without batteries or generators, communication devices that transmitted across vast distances without wires. Some of their inventions were patented, documented, witnessed by credible observers. And then, systematically, they were suppressed. Patents were seized under national security provisions. Laboratories burned. Researchers died under suspicious circumstances or simply disappeared from public life. The knowledge did not vanish entirely. It continued to circulate in underground networks, in private correspondence, in the notes of researchers who kept working despite the dangers. But it was pushed to the margins, labeled as pseudoscience or fraud, excluded from the official narratives of technological progress. By the early 20th century, the concept of the ether itself was being erased from physics. The Michelson-Morley experiment of 1887, which failed to detect the Earth's motion through the ether, was reinterpreted as proof that the ether did not exist, that space was not a medium but a vacuum, empty of everything except the fields and particles that relativity and quantum mechanics would come to describe. This reinterpretation was not inevitable. The experiment's null result could have been explained in other ways, by different properties of the ether, by different assumptions about how light propagates. But the interpretation that prevailed was the one that eliminated the ether entirely, that reconceptualized space as emptiness rather than fullness, that closed off the line of inquiry Tesla and others had been following. It is difficult not to see this as convenient, as a scientific decision that served economic and political interests by making certain technologies theoretically impossible, by defining the universe in ways that foreclosed alternatives to centralized, controllable, profitable energy systems. You think back to the Tartarian buildings, to the domes and towers and geometric precision, and you begin to see them in a new light. What if they were not just beautiful or symbolic, but functional? What if they were part of a global infrastructure designed to tap into the ether, to resonate with the Earth's electromagnetic field, to generate and distribute energy without combustion, without extraction, without the ecological devastation that would come to define the industrial age? The positioning of the buildings, often on high ground or at the confluence of waterways, the materials used in their construction, the copper and iron that crown their spires, the geometric ratios encoded in their proportions. All of these details suggest design with a purpose beyond aesthetics. The domes act as resonant cavities, amplifying specific frequencies. The towers function as antennas, coupling with atmospheric currents. The buildings themselves become nodes in a network, each one contributing to and drawing from a field of energy that encompasses the entire planet. If such a system existed, its destruction would have been catastrophic, not in the sense of a single violent event, but as a gradual fading, a detuning, as more and more nodes were taken offline, buried, demolished, or modified in ways that broke their connection to the network. The great fires, the mud floods, the systematic dismantling of old architecture and its replacement with modern buildings that do not resonate. All of these can be understood as part of a coordinated effort to disable a technology that was incompatible with the fossil fuel economy that was being established. The people living through this transition might not have understood what was happening. They would have experienced it as progress, as modernization, as the inevitable march toward a more scientific, more rational, more efficient way of organizing society. The lights that had once burned without visible power sources would flicker and die, and new lights, powered by coal-fired generators and copper wires, would replace them. The old buildings would seem quaint, relics of a less advanced age, and no one would think to ask whether what was lost might have been superior in ways that mattered, in ways that the new system was designed to obscure. There are still researchers who work with these concepts, who build devices based on principles of resonance and atmospheric energy, who claim to achieve results that mainstream science says are impossible. They operate in the shadows, sharing their findings in small journals and online forums, aware that too much visibility brings attention of the wrong kind. Some have experienced what earlier researchers experienced: laboratories raided, equipment confiscated, funding sources mysteriously withdrawn. The suppression continues, though it is more subtle now, more easily dismissed as the natural consequence of working outside accepted paradigms, rather than as active interference. But the pattern persists, and it suggests that whatever was at stake in the late 19th century, whatever motivated the destruction of Tesla's work and the erasure of the ether from physics, is still at stake now, still being protected, still being defended against anyone who might rediscover what was lost. You wonder what the world would look like if the trajectory had been different, if the ether-based technologies had been allowed to develop rather than being suppressed, if the Tartarian infrastructure had been preserved and studied and extended, rather than demolished and forgotten. Cities lit by resonance rather than combustion. Transportation powered by the Earth's own electromagnetic field. Communication instantaneous and ubiquitous, without the need for cables or satellites. An economy of abundance rather than scarcity, where energy is not a commodity to be controlled, but a commons to be shared. It sounds utopian, impossibly idealistic, the kind of vision that ignores the realities of human nature and power. But what if it is not a fantasy? What if it is a memory, not of something that might be, but of something that was? A world that existed before it was deliberately dismantled, before the Great Reset that ushered in the age we now inhabit. The evidence is fragmentary, scattered, often ambiguous. A patent here, a photograph there, a passage in a forgotten journal, a structure that still stands, but whose purpose has been misunderstood. But when you gather these fragments, when you arrange them into a pattern, they begin to tell a story that is remarkably coherent, remarkably consistent. They tell of a civilization that understood energy differently, that built its infrastructure according to principles of resonance and harmony, rather than force and extraction. They tell of a moment in the late 19th century when that civilization's remnants were still visible, still functional, still capable of demonstrating an alternative to the path industrial society was taking. And they tell of a systematic effort to eliminate those remnants, to erase the memory of what they represented, to ensure that the new system would be the only system, that no alternatives would survive to challenge the monopoly of fossil fuels and centralized power. In old archives, you sometimes find references to phenomena that no longer occur, to experiences that people in the 19th century took for granted, but which have vanished from modern life. They speak of atmospheric effects, of certain buildings that seem to hum with energy, of lights that appeared in the sky without explanation, of a quality to the air that made people feel more vital, more connected, more alive. These accounts are usually dismissed as superstition, as the imaginings of people who did not understand the natural world. But what if they were accurate descriptions of a world that was still partially connected to the ether-based infrastructure? A world in transition between one form of technology and another. What if the reason we no longer experience these phenomena is not that our ancestors were deluded, but that the conditions that produced them have been eliminated, that the field in which they occurred has been shut down, that we live now in a world deliberately detuned from frequencies that once nourished and sustained not just our technologies, but our consciousness itself. The Tartarian buildings that survive are trying to tell us something. They stand as monuments not to a dead past, but to a living possibility, to a way of understanding and working with energy that we have been trained not to see. The domes still gather frequencies from the sky. The towers still reach toward the upper atmosphere. The geometric patterns still encode ratios that resonate with the mathematical structure of the universe. But we walk past them without recognition, without understanding, seeing only decoration where once there was function, only history where once there was technology. The knowledge sleeps in the stones, waiting for minds capable of reading it, for a time when humanity is ready to remember what it has forgotten, to ask the questions that were supposed to remain unasked, to consider the possibility that the path we are on is not the only path, that alternatives existed and might exist again if we could only learn to tune ourselves to the right frequency. Tesla died alone in a New York hotel room in 1943, his papers confiscated by government agents immediately after his death, his inventions scattered or classified or simply lost. But his vision remains, encoded in his patents, preserved in his writings, echoing in the structures he built and the principles he discovered. He was trying to give humanity access to unlimited energy, to free us from dependence on scarce resources and the power structures that control them. He failed, or was prevented from succeeding, and the world took a different turn. But the ether is still there. The field still surrounds us. The possibility still exists. It waits in the space between what we know and what we are allowed to know, in the gap between the official story and the evidence that refuses to fit, in the quiet hum that you can almost hear. you stand in those old domed spaces and let yourself become still enough to remember what silence sounded like before it was filled with the noise of machines burning their way through finite fuel toward an uncertain future. If you have ever stood beneath power lines and felt them buzz with a frequency that makes your teeth ache, if you have ever wondered whether there might be a cleaner way, a quieter way, a way that works with the earth rather than against it, then you know what I am describing. You know that what we call progress might have been a narrowing rather than an expansion, a closing off of possibilities rather than an opening toward them. And if that knowing feels real to you, if it touches something deeper than theory or speculation, then write the word "still" in the comments below, and I will understand that you are ready for what comes next. Ready to follow this investigation into the places where forgotten technology and suppressed history and the resonant memory of a different world all converge into a single question. What if everything could be different? And what if we once knew how? Chapter 8. Ruins Beneath the Snow. There are places in Siberia where the ground never fully thaws, where the permafrost extends down hundreds of feet, preserving everything it touches in a state of frozen suspension. The temperature at the surface hovers around -40 degrees Fahrenheit for months at a time, cold enough that exposed skin freezes in minutes, cold enough that breath crystallizes in the air before it can dissipate. And yet, beneath this desolate landscape, beneath the endless expanse of snow and ice that stretches from the Ural Mountains to the Pacific Ocean, there are structures. Massive walls of stone, foundations that extend deeper than any modern building would require, metallic objects that do not corrode despite their age, geometric patterns carved into rock faces that seem to serve no decorative purpose, but which follow mathematical ratios with unsettling precision. These are not the remains of primitive settlements or nomadic encampments. These are the ruins of cities, of infrastructure, of a civilization that built on a scale and with a sophistication that should not exist, according to the official timeline of human development in this region. You find yourself reading the account of a Russian geological expedition from 1912, led by a man named Vladimir Obruchev, who ventured into a remote area near the Vilyui River in search of mineral deposits. What they found instead was something that the official reports barely mention, something that was classified and buried in archives, where it would remain largely forgotten for decades. The expedition encountered what they described as metallic cauldrons, enormous hemisphere structures half buried in swampland, their surfaces smooth and seemingly fused from a single piece of metal that none of the geologists could identify. The objects were warm to the touch, despite the freezing air temperature, and instruments showed that they emitted a faint but measurable magnetic field. Local Yakut tribes had stories about these structures, warnings passed down through generations that animals who slept near them never woke, that people who spent too long in their vicinity became sick, with symptoms that sound remarkably like radiation poisoning, though of course that term would not have been available to describe the phenomenon in the early 20th century. The expedition attempted to excavate one of the cauldrons to determine its depth and extent, but after digging down more than 20 feet without reaching the bottom, without finding any seam or joint that would indicate how it was constructed, they abandoned the effort. Some of the team members wanted to continue, to bring in more equipment, to study these objects systematically. But when they returned to civilization and filed their reports, they were told that the structures were probably natural formations, unusual mineral deposits shaped by geological processes, nothing worth further investigation. The area was declared geologically uninteresting, and subsequent expeditions were directed elsewhere. When researchers tried to return to the site decades later, they found that the landscape had changed, the swamps had expanded, and the cauldrons had sunk deeper, as though the earth were swallowing them, reclaiming them, hiding them beneath layers of mud and ice. Some say the structures are still there, waiting beneath the surface, but the exact coordinates were never properly recorded, and the region is so vast, so remote, so hostile to human presence, that systematic searches have proven impossible. But these metallic cauldrons are not the only anomaly. Throughout Siberia, throughout Mongolia, throughout the northern regions that old maps once labeled as Tartaria, there are reports of underground complexes, vast tunnel systems carved through solid rock with a precision that modern drilling equipment struggles to match. Local traditions speak of these tunnels as ancient highways, as passages that once connected distant cities, allowing travel and trade across thousands of miles without exposure to the harsh surface conditions. Some of the tunnels have been explored, at least partially, and what explorers describe is unsettling. The walls are smooth, too smooth to have been carved by hand, showing no tool marks, no irregularities, as though the rock had been melted or dissolved rather than chipped away. The tunnels follow straight lines for miles, curving only to avoid major geological features, maintaining consistent dimensions and grades that suggest engineering capabilities far beyond what should have been available to ancient peoples. And in some sections, there are side chambers, rooms carved into the walls, their purposes unknown, their dimensions following the same geometric ratios you have come to recognize in Tartarian architecture above ground. Modern surveys using ground-penetrating radar and seismic imaging have revealed the extent of these underground structures, and the scale is staggering. Beneath the surface of Siberia and Mongolia, there appears to be a network of tunnels and chambers extending for thousands of miles, connecting regions that have no obvious relationship in the official history. Some of these passages run beneath mountain ranges, beneath rivers, beneath terrain that would have been impossible to traverse with pre-industrial technology. And their depth varies. Some are just below the surface, accessible through cave entrances or sinkholes, while others extend down hundreds of feet, far deeper than any practical purpose would seem to require. The deepest passages run along lines that do not correspond to modern political boundaries or transportation routes, but which do correspond, with remarkable accuracy, to magnetic field lines, to the natural currents of the Earth's electromagnetic field, as though whoever built these tunnels understood geomancy not as superstition, but as science, as a way of mapping and utilizing energies that flow through the planet itself. In Mongolia, there are stories of a hidden realm called Agartha, an underground kingdom that supposedly exists beneath the Gobi Desert and the surrounding mountains, accessible through secret entrances known only to initiated monks and mystics. Western accounts from the 19th century dismissed these stories as fantasy, as religious mythology with no basis in reality. But when you examine the geological evidence, when you note the documented existence of vast cave systems and artificial tunnels in precisely the regions where the legends locate Agartha, the boundary between myth and history becomes less clear. Perhaps Agartha was not a spiritual realm, but a physical one. Not a mystical kingdom, but the remnants of Tartarian infrastructure, underground cities that survived whatever catastrophe destroyed or buried the surface civilization. Perhaps the monks and mystics who claim to have visited these places were not describing visions, but memories, preserving knowledge of passages and chambers that most people had forgotten existed. There is a phenomenon that occurs in these northern regions, something that locals have observed for centuries, but which scientists struggle to explain. On certain nights, particularly during geomagnetic storms when auroras dance across the sky. The ground itself seems to hum. A low-frequency vibration that you feel more than hear, that resonates in your chest and makes it difficult to sleep. Instruments placed on the surface record these vibrations, which occur at frequencies around 7 to 8 Hertz, the same range as the Schumann resonance, the natural electromagnetic oscillation of the Earth's atmosphere. But the vibrations seem to be strongest, not just anywhere, but at specific locations. Places where old ruins have been found, where the underground tunnels are closest to the surface, as though the structures themselves are resonating with the geomagnetic activity, as though they were designed to do so, to couple with the Earth's electromagnetic field and amplify it in ways that serve purposes we can no longer understand. In 2022, seismic monitoring stations in Yakutia recorded something unusual. A series of infrasound pulses that repeated with mechanical regularity every 12 hours for 3 days straight. The frequency of these pulses was approximately 7.83 Hertz, precisely matching the fundamental Schumann resonance. The pattern was so regular, so precise, that it could not be attributed to any known natural phenomenon. Earthquakes are irregular. Volcanic activity produces different frequency signatures, and no geological process creates pulses that repeat at exactly 12-hour intervals. Some researchers suggested the signals might be related to human activity, to industrial operations or military testing. But there were no facilities in the region capable of generating such signals, and no government agency claimed responsibility. The signals simply appeared, persisted for 3 days, and then stopped, leaving behind only the data recorded by automated instruments and a lingering question about what might exist beneath the Siberian permafrost, still functioning after centuries of silence, still capable of generating signals that echo the planet's own electromagnetic heartbeat. You think about those Tartarian towers, about the copper spires and geometric domes, about the architectural precision that seemed excessive for purely aesthetic purposes, and you begin to see them as part of a system, nodes in a network that extended both above and below ground. The towers would capture atmospheric electricity, channel it down through the buildings into the underground infrastructure, where it would propagate through the tunnel network, following the natural conductivity of the Earth, emerging at distant locations to power other structures, other cities, other technologies. The system would be self-regulating, tuned to resonate with the Earth's own frequencies, drawing energy not from combustion or mechanical generation, but from the constant electromagnetic activity of the planet itself. And when that system was destroyed, when the towers were torn down and the underground passages sealed or forgotten, the network would have collapsed, the energy would have stopped flowing, and the civilization that depended on it would have faded, not through conquest or plague, but through disconnection, through the loss of the infrastructure that sustained it. The evidence is scattered, fragmentary, often indirect, but it points consistently toward the same conclusion. Beneath the surface of the Earth, particularly in the regions once labeled as Tartaria, there are remnants of a technological infrastructure that we do not understand, that we were not supposed to discover, that has been deliberately obscured through a combination of natural burial and systematic erasure. The frozen ground preserves these remnants, holds them in suspension, waiting for a time when the ice melts enough to reveal them fully, or when someone develops the motivation and resources to excavate systematically, to map the underground networks, to study the metallic cauldrons and mysterious chambers, to ask what they were for and who built them, and why every reference to them has been quietly removed from official histories. But that time has not come. The regions remain remote, access is restricted, And the few researchers who do venture into these territories find their work discouraged, their funding withdrawn, their discoveries classified, or dismissed as misidentifications of natural formations. And yet the land remembers. The stones remember. The metal structures buried beneath permafrost continue to emit their faint magnetic fields, continue to resonate at frequencies that instruments can detect, even if human senses cannot. On clear winter nights, when the auroras paint the sky in curtains of green and purple light, when the air is so cold it seems to crystallize around you, if you stand in certain places, if you allow yourself to become still enough, you can feel it. A vibration rising from below, a hum that seems to come from the earth itself, as though something vast and ancient is still functioning in the darkness, still maintaining its vigil, still waiting for the moment when humanity will be ready to remember what it built, what it knew, what it lost, when the surface world was reset, and the old civilization was pushed underground, or into extinction, or simply into the category of myth, where it could be safely ignored by those who prefer their history simple, their timelines linear, their progress inevitable. The indigenous peoples of Siberia and Mongolia have stories that go back further than written records, stories passed down orally through countless generations. And in these stories, the underground realm is not fantasy but memory. They speak of ancestors who knew the passages, who traveled beneath the earth when the surface was too dangerous, who maintained the old technologies until they too were forgotten or forbidden. They speak of doors in mountains that once opened but are now sealed, of lights that once burned in the depths but are now dark, of sounds that once echoed through the tunnels but are now silent. These stories are dismissed by academics as folklore, as mythology, as the primitive imaginings of pre-scientific peoples. But what if they are not imaginings? What if they are history, preserved in the only form available to cultures without writing, encoded in narrative and symbol, and passed down with the understanding that someday someone would need to know where to look, how to recognize the signs, when to ask the questions that would lead back to the buried truth. You stand now in imagination on the frozen steppe, the wind cutting through layers of clothing, the sky vast and empty above you, the ground solid beneath your feet, but you know now that the solidity is illusion, that beneath the permafrost lie structures and passages and technologies that were never supposed to be found, that the emptiness above mirrors an entirely different kind of emptiness below, the emptiness of chambers designed for purposes we have forgotten, of tunnels meant for traffic that no longer flows, of a network that once connected a civilization and now connects only to silence. The snow falls, covering everything, adding another layer to the centuries of forgetting. And somewhere beneath it all, the old structures wait, patient as stone, cold as the ice that preserves them, holding their secrets until the earth decides to give them up, or until someone decides to dig deep enough to remember. If you can feel that frozen ground, if you can sense the presence of something vast and patient waiting beneath the ice, if you understand that the silence of the north is not absence, but a kind of sleep, then you have traveled far with me, deeper than most are willing to go, closer to the heart of the mystery than is comfortable or safe. And if you want to continue, if you are ready to follow this thread down into the last few chambers of this investigation, then write the word "still" in the comments, and I will know that you are ready for what remains to be revealed, ready to discover what the ruins beneath the snow have been trying to tell us all along. Chapter 9. Planetary Memory. There are nights in Siberia when the sky becomes a cathedral of light, when auroras cascade from the upper atmosphere in sheets of green and violet and crimson, moving with a fluidity that seems almost conscious, almost intentional. The temperature on such nights drops to 20 below zero Fahrenheit or colder, the air so clear and dry that stars seem close enough to touch. And if you stand outside long enough, if you allow the cold to quiet your thoughts and still your body, you begin to feel something that has no name in modern languages. It is not quite sound and not quite sensation, but something between the two. A vibration that seems to rise from the ground and descend from the sky simultaneously, meeting in your chest, in your bones, in the spaces between your heartbeats. The indigenous peoples have words for this phenomenon, words that translate awkwardly as the earth's breathing or the singing of stones. And they say that on nights when the auroras are strongest, when the magnetosphere trembles with solar winds, the old structures wake, the ancient technologies remember their purpose, and for a few hours, the world becomes what it once was, connected, resonant, alive with frequencies that modern civilization has forgotten how to hear. Scientists measure these phenomena with instruments that record what human senses cannot fully perceive. Magnetometers detect fluctuations in the Earth's magnetic field, variations that follow patterns too complex to be random, but too subtle to be easily understood. Infrasound monitors pick up frequencies below the threshold of human hearing. Oscillations at 7.83 Hertz, the fundamental Schumann resonance, the electromagnetic pulse that circles the planet every second, a kind of planetary heartbeat that has been constant for as long as measurements have been taken. But on certain nights, during certain geomagnetic storms, this resonance strengthens, its harmonics become more pronounced. And if you map where the strongest signals occur, you find that they cluster around specific locations, places where old ruins have been discovered, where Tartarian architecture still stands, where the underground tunnel networks are known to exist. It is as though the planet itself is trying to activate something, to send a signal through a network that no longer fully functions, to wake technologies that have been sleeping for more than a century. In 2022, on a clear October night, when auroras stretched as far south as northern China, seismic stations across Yakutia recorded something unprecedented. For 3 consecutive days, beginning at precisely midnight local time, infrasound pulses emerged from multiple points in the region, synchronized with a precision that no natural process could explain. The pulses occurred every 12 hours, each one lasting approximately 8 minutes, oscillating at frequencies that matched not only the Schumann resonance, but also its higher harmonics, the overtones that occur at 14.1, 20.3, and 26.4 Hertz. The pattern was too regular to be geological, too widespread to originate from any single source, and too precisely timed to be coincidental. It was as though something beneath the Earth, something distributed across hundreds or thousands of miles, had briefly reactivated, had synchronized with the planet's electromagnetic field, had begun transmitting a signal whose meaning remained opaque, but whose intentionality seemed undeniable. You think about those Tartarian buildings again, about the domes engineered to resonate at specific frequencies, about the towers designed to couple with atmospheric electricity, about the underground passages that follow magnetic field lines. What if they were never separate structures, but components of a single system? A planetary infrastructure designed to work with the Earth's natural energies, rather than against them. The domes would act as resonators, amplifying the Schumann resonance and its harmonics. The towers would serve as antennas, capturing variations in the ionosphere and channeling them downward. The underground tunnels would function as waveguides, conducting these energies along paths of least resistance, following the natural geometry of the Earth's electromagnetic field. And the entire network would be tuned, calibrated, synchronized to resonate with the planet itself, to draw power from its rotation, its magnetic field, its constant interaction with solar radiation. Such a system would be invisible to anyone who did not know what to look for, would leave no exhaust, produce no waste, require no fuel except what the Earth provides continuously. And such a system would be nearly impossible to destroy completely, because its infrastructure would be distributed, redundant, woven into the fabric of the planet itself. But it could be detuned. It could be disconnected. Remove enough of the nodes, demolish enough of the towers, seal enough of the passages, and the network would lose coherence, would fragment into isolated components that could no longer communicate, could no longer synchronize, could no longer maintain the standing waves that made the system function. The energy would still be there. The Earth would still generate its electromagnetic field. The Schumann resonance would still circle the globe. But without the infrastructure to capture and utilize these energies, they would remain potential rather than actual. Invisible currents that flow through and around us without providing any tangible benefit. And that, perhaps, is what happened to Tartaria. Its civilization was not conquered through military force,
Not destroyed by plague or famine.
not eroded by gradual decline. It was silenced, deliberately and systematically, through the destruction of the infrastructure that sustained it, through the dismantling of a technology that made centralized control impossible, that distributed power so widely that no one could monopolize it, that created abundance where scarcity was needed to maintain hierarchies of wealth and influence. The indigenous peoples of the northern regions speak of a time before the silence, when their ancestors could communicate across vast distances without messengers, when certain stones sang audibly during storms, when buildings glowed with a soft light that required no fire or fuel. These accounts are preserved in oral traditions that stretch back further than written history, and they are remarkably consistent across different cultures separated by thousands of miles. The Yakuts describe luminous spires that stood in the tundra, visible for miles, that pulsed in rhythm with the auroras. The Mongols speak of underground halls where the walls themselves emitted light, where travelers could rest without need of torches or lamps. The indigenous Siberians tell of a network of sacred sites, places where the veil between earth and sky was thin, where shamans could hear the voice of the planet itself and receive knowledge directly from the stones. Modern anthropology treats these as myths, as religious beliefs that reflect pre-scientific attempts to understand natural phenomena. But what if they are not interpretations, but descriptions? Not metaphors, but memories of technologies that actually existed and functioned exactly as the stories describe. There is a concept in physics called morphic resonance, proposed by the biologist Rupert Sheldrake. suggesting that patterns of organization, once established, create fields that make it easier for similar patterns to form again. That memory is not stored only in individual brains or genes, but in the structure of reality itself. The idea is controversial, rejected by mainstream science, but it offers an interesting framework for thinking about what might persist after a civilization falls. If Tartaria built a global infrastructure tuned to the Earth's electromagnetic field, if millions of people lived within that field for generations, if their consciousness itself became entrained to the frequencies the system generated, then even after the physical infrastructure was destroyed, even after the buildings were demolished and the knowledge forgotten, some pattern might remain, encoded not in stone or metal, but in the field itself, in the subtle organization of electromagnetic currents, in the way the planet continues to resonate at frequencies that once sustained a civilization. And, occasionally, when conditions are right, when solar activity strengthens the magnetosphere and the Schumann resonance amplifies, that old pattern might briefly reassert itself, might create echoes of what once was, might generate those mysterious infrasound pulses that seem to emerge from nowhere and serve no obvious purpose. You wonder what it would take to reactivate the system fully, to restore the connections that were broken, to retune the remaining structures so they could once again synchronize with each other and with the planet. The knowledge seems lost, buried in archives that were deliberately scattered or destroyed, encoded in architectural proportions that no one remembers how to read. But perhaps the knowledge is not entirely lost. Perhaps it persists in the structures themselves, in the ratios and angles and resonant properties that were built into every dome and tower and chamber. Perhaps it waits in the underground passages, in the metallic cauldrons buried beneath permafrost, in the geometric patterns carved into stone walls. Perhaps it survives in the oral traditions of indigenous peoples, in the shamanic practices that seem primitive to modern observers, but which might be preserving techniques for perceiving and working with energies that our instruments can barely detect. And perhaps it lingers in the morphic field itself, in the pattern that was established centuries ago, and which continues to influence how electromagnetic currents flow around the planet, waiting for minds capable of recognizing it, for hands capable of rebuilding what was dismantled, for a civilization mature enough to choose abundance over scarcity, harmony over extraction, resonance over combustion. In certain monasteries in the Ural Mountains, monks still practice forms of chanting that they claim have been preserved unchanged for more than 1,000 years. The chants use vowels that resonate in the chest and skull, that create standing waves in enclosed spaces, that seem designed not for musical beauty, but for physiological and perhaps neurological effects. Visitors describe feeling the floor vibrate, the walls pulse, their own bodies beginning to resonate with frequencies they cannot quite hear. Some report visions, altered states of consciousness, a sense of connection to something vast and ancient. The monks say they are singing the Earth's song, that the words and melodies were given to them by the stones themselves, that the practice maintains a link to knowledge that must not be allowed to die completely. Western researchers who have studied these chants find that they produce measurable effects on brain activity, shifting consciousness toward states associated with deep meditation, with increased coherence between different regions of the brain, with heightened sensitivity to subtle environmental cues. But the monks insist the purpose is not personal development or spiritual enlightenment in any conventional sense. They say they are maintaining a circuit, keeping alive a frequency that would otherwise fade, preserving a note that the planet needs to hear, even if humans have forgotten why. There is a growing collection of anomalous data, gathered by researchers working outside mainstream institutions, that points toward something strange occurring in the Earth's electromagnetic field. Certain locations show persistent magnetic anomalies that do not correspond to known mineral deposits or geological features. Instruments placed at these sites record fluctuations that follow patterns reminiscent of information encoding, as though the field itself were carrying signals whose source and destination remain unknown. Some of these locations correspond to ancient sacred sites, to places where Tartarian ruins have been found, to nodes in the hypothetical global network. And the signals seem to strengthen during periods of high solar activity, during geomagnetic storms, during the very conditions that would have powered the old infrastructure if it were still functional. It is as though the planet is trying to complete a circuit, to restore a connection, to wake something that has been sleeping. But the circuit remains incomplete, the connection broken, and the signals fade back into background noise, waiting for someone to rebuild the missing links, to remember how the system worked, to choose to reactivate technologies that were suppressed because they threatened to make the modern world obsolete before it could fully establish itself. You stand now, in imagination, under that aurora-lit sky, feeling the cold, sensing the vibration that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere. And you understand something that cannot be easily put into words. The Earth is not a dead rock spinning through empty space. It is a living system, generating fields and currents and resonances that shape everything that exists within them. And we, humanity, are not separate from this system, but part of it, evolved within these fields, dependent on these frequencies in ways we have barely begun to understand. When Tartaria fell, when its infrastructure was destroyed, we lost more than buildings and technologies. We lost attunement, lost the ability to perceive and work with the subtle energies that permeate existence, lost connection to something that our ancestors knew and that we have been trying to remember ever since, through religion, through science, through art, through every attempt to understand our place in a cosmos that feels simultaneously intimate and incomprehensibly vast. The ruins beneath the snow, the demolished towers, the buried passages, these are not just remnants of a lost civilization. They are messages, instructions, reminders that other ways of being are possible, that the path we are on is not inevitable, that somewhere in the forgotten past lies knowledge we will need for any viable future. The auroras dance, the earth hums, and in the spaces between what we know and what we sense, in the gap between the official story and the stubborn evidence, something waits. Not passively, not inertly, but actively, patiently, with the patience of stone and the persistence of electromagnetic fields that have circled the planet for millions of years, and will continue long after our civilization is dust. The question is not whether we will remember. The question is when, and whether we will remember in time, before the disconnection becomes so complete that we can no longer perceive what we have lost. Before the frequencies that sustained our ancestors fade so far into background noise that we mistake silence for the natural state of things. The planet still sings, softly, endlessly, waiting for those who have ears to hear, for those who can feel the vibration in their bones, for those who are willing to stand in the cold and the dark and the presence of something vast and ancient, and ask, what if we remembered? What if we rebuilt? What if we choose to resonate again with the song that was always there, waiting beneath the silence, waiting beneath the snow, waiting in the planetary memory that holds everything and forgets nothing, that will reveal its secrets when we are finally ready to know them. If you have felt that vibration, if you can hear that song playing at the edge of perception, if you understand that the world remembers even what we have forgotten, then you have traveled with me to the end of this journey, to the place where history and myth and suppressed science and the living memory of the earth all converge into a single recognition. The empire of forgetting was real. The civilization that sang with the planet existed. And somewhere in the resonance that still surrounds us, in the frequency that still pulses through the ground beneath our feet, it waits to return. Not as something lost, but as something that was always present, always possible, always just one choice away from becoming real again. Thank you for walking this path with me, for listening with more than ears, for allowing yourself to remember what you were taught to forget. And if something in you has shifted, if the world feels a little less solid and a little more alive, if you can sense the hum that underlies everything, then you know what must be done. Not all at once, not through force or revolution, but quietly, patiently, by learning to listen again, by rebuilding the connections one frequency at a time, by remembering that we too are part of the song, and that our voices, when tuned to the right resonance, can help wake the world from its long forgetting. So, here we are, at the end of a long journey through forgotten maps and buried cities, through fires that burned too hot and fairs that vanished too quickly, through technologies suppressed and memories erased. You have walked with me through archives and ruins, through the cold silence of Siberian permafrost, and the resonant chambers of ancient domes. You have seen the evidence that refuses to fit the official story, the photographs that show what should not exist, the patterns that repeat too consistently to be coincidence. And now, as we stand together at this threshold between what we were told and what we have discovered, the question becomes not what happened to Tartaria, but what does it mean for us, here, now, in our own time of forgetting and remembering. The truth, if we can call it that, is simpler and stranger than conspiracy. Tartaria was not destroyed by a single catastrophic event, not erased by a deliberate plot hatched in smoke-filled rooms. It faded because it was incompatible, because it represented a way of organizing reality that could not coexist with the world that was being born in the 19th century. The industrial age required extraction, required scarcity, required centralized control of resources and energy. It needed people to be dependent, to be consumers, to be workers in a system that concentrated wealth and power in fewer and fewer hands. A civilization built on free energy, on technologies that anyone could access, on an infrastructure that distributed abundance rather than hoarding it. Such a civilization was not just inconvenient, it was impossible to permit. And so it was detuned, disconnected, demolished, and finally forgotten. Not through violence, but through the systematic rewriting of memory. Through the patient work of generations who genuinely believed they were bringing progress, who never understood that what they called advancement was actually a narrowing, a reduction of possibilities, a closing off of paths that humanity had once walked. But here is what they could not erase. What remains despite all the fires and floods and demolitions. The Earth still generates its electromagnetic field. The Schumann resonance still circles the planet every second.
The aurora still dances in northern skies.
The stones still remember the frequencies they were carved to amplify. The geometry of those old buildings still encodes ratios that resonate with mathematical laws deeper than any human institution. The planet itself is still singing the same song it always sang. And somewhere in our bodies, in our consciousness, in the depths of human perception that we have learned to ignore but cannot quite eliminate, we can still hear it. That faint hum, that subtle vibration, that sense of something vast and harmonious moving just beneath the threshold of ordinary awareness. It is not imagination. It is memory. It is the planet reminding us of what we were, what we knew, what we might become again if we choose to listen. The lesson of Tartaria is not that we should try to rebuild their civilization exactly as it was. We do not have enough information, do not understand enough of the principles, do not live in a world that would support such a reconstruction. But we can learn from what happened, can recognize the pattern of how knowledge becomes suppressed, how alternatives become invisible, how entire ways of understanding reality can be erased within a few generations through nothing more than the control of education, the shaping of narratives, the patient insistence that what exists now is the only thing that ever could have existed. We live in our own moment of forgetting, in our own time of narrowing possibilities, and the systems that shape our lives, that determine what we can imagine and what we can build, operate through the same mechanisms that erased Tartaria from collective memory. They do not need to be consciously conspiratorial. They only need to privilege certain kinds of knowledge while marginalizing others, to reward certain questions while punishing different ones, to build institutions that perpetuate themselves by defining reality in ways that make alternatives literally unthinkable. But the alternatives remain, waiting in the margins, in the anomalies, in the evidence that does not fit, in the experiences that people have but learn not to talk about, because there is no language, no framework, no permission to take them seriously. Every person who stands in an old building and feels it resonate, who looks at those photographs of impossible fairs and senses that something is wrong with the story, who walks through a city and notices the buried windows and wonders what lies beneath. Every person who asks these questions is performing an act of resistance against the forgetting, is keeping alive the possibility that other ways of being exist, that the world is stranger and more open than we have been taught to believe. And this matters, not just for historical accuracy or intellectual satisfaction, but because the choices we make now, the technologies we develop, the systems we build, will determine what future generations remember about us, will shape what becomes possible for them, and what becomes inconceivable. We stand at our own moment of transition, perhaps as significant as the one that erased Tartaria. The fossil fuel economy that replaced their resonance-based technology is failing, depleting, destroying the biosphere that sustains us. The centralized systems that concentrated power and wealth are showing their fragility, their inability to solve the problems they created. We are being forced to imagine alternatives, to consider different ways of generating energy, organizing society, relating to the earth. And in this moment, the memory of Tartaria becomes relevant again, not as a blueprint to copy, but as proof that alternatives have existed. that humanity has walked other paths, that the trajectory we are on is not inevitable or natural, but contingent, chosen, and therefore capable of being unchosen, redirected, reimagined. The resonance technologies may be beyond our current capabilities to reconstruct, but the principle behind them, the understanding that we can work with natural systems rather than against them, that abundance is possible if we design for it, that energy does not have to be scarce or controlled. These insights remain valid, remain necessary, remain the seeds of whatever comes next. So, what do we do with this knowledge, with this story of forgetting, and the stubborn evidence that refuses to stay buried? We remember first. We hold in our minds the complexity, the strangeness, the possibility that history is not what we were told, that progress is not linear, that civilizations have risen and fallen and left traces that challenge our assumptions. We share these stories, carefully, thoughtfully, not as certainties, but as questions, not as doctrines, but as invitations to look more closely, to think more deeply, to consider possibilities that consensus reality excludes. We support researchers who work at the margins, who ask uncomfortable questions, who follow evidence into places that mainstream institutions will not go. We learn to perceive differently, to notice the anomalies in our own cities, the buried layers, the architectural resonances, the subtle electromagnetic fields that instruments can measure, but that we have trained ourselves not to feel. We practice listening, actual physical listening, to the low frequencies, to the vibrations in buildings, to the hum of the earth itself. And we begin, slowly, carefully, to experiment with building differently, with designing spaces that resonate rather than just contain, with creating technologies that work with natural frequencies rather than overwhelming them. This is not a call to abandon modernity, or reject science, or retreat into mysticism. It is an invitation to expand what we consider possible, to remember that science itself is a human practice, shaped by institutions and funding and assumptions, that there are ways of knowing the world that we have excluded, not because they are false, but because they are inconvenient or unprofitable, or threatening to established interests. The Tartarian ruins are still there, waiting beneath snow and under streets, holding their geometric secrets in stone and metal. The earth is still singing its electromagnetic song, and we are still capable of learning to hear it, of remembering what we forgot, of choosing a different path than the one that leads through extraction and depletion toward collapse. The choice has always been available. It remains available now. The only question is whether we will make it, whether we will let ourselves remember, whether we will trust the evidence of anomalies more than the comfort of official stories. Thank you for staying until the end, for allowing these ideas to move through your consciousness, for considering possibilities that most people never think to question. If something has shifted in you, if the world feels different now, less solid perhaps, but more alive, more mysterious, more full of potential, then this journey has accomplished what it was meant to accomplish. You are not the same as when we began. You have walked through forgetting and emerged on the other side, carrying memories that are not quite yours, sensing connections that official history denies, hearing frequencies that consensus reality insists do not exist, and that makes you dangerous, in the best possible way. Dangerous to systems that depend on amnesia, to institutions that require certainty, to narratives that cannot survive questions. Hold on to that dangerous awareness. Let it guide you toward whatever comes next. And know that somewhere, in the ruins beneath the snow, in the stones that still remember, in the planetary field that holds everything, the old song continues, waiting for voices that remember how to sing it, waiting for minds that remember how to hear it,
waiting for a world ready to wake from its long forgetting and remember what it means to resonate.
If you feel ready to carry this forward, if you sense that remembering is not just an intellectual exercise, but a responsibility, a gift, a burden worth bearing, then you know what I am asking without me having to say it directly. Share this knowledge carefully. Question persistently. Listen deeply. Build differently. And above all, never forget that the world tried to forget. That empires of amnesia rise and fall. That truth persists in the margins until the center can no longer hold. And that every person who remembers on behalf of those who forgot becomes a node in a network that may one day, in some unimaginable future, resonate again, with frequencies we have not heard for more than a century, but which the earth has never stopped generating, never stopped offering, never stopped waiting for us to notice and utilize and honor. And finally, mercifully, gratefully, remember.